It was a night that changed the course of history, a night when shadows moved through Germany and whispers of betrayal turned into the thunder of gunfire. In June 1934, Adolf Hitler, still consolidating his power as Chancellor, faced a choice that would define not only his regime, but the fate of an entire nation. The world watched a Germany still reeling from the Great Depression, weighed down by humiliation after Versailles, and torn between rival factions within the Nazi Party. At the heart of the storm stood the paramilitary SA, the million-strong street force led by Ernst Röhm, whose ambitions clashed with Hitler's vision, and whose power threatened to destabilize the delicate alliances holding the Third Reich together. In just 3 days of calculated violence, what became known as the Night of the Long Knives would see the purge of old comrades, the silencing of critics, and the ruthless rise of the SS as the new enforcers of terror. It was not a battle fought with tanks or armies, but a cold and clinical act of political murder, a cleansing of rivals that sent a message to Germany and the world. Hitler would stop at nothing to hold absolute control. From secret lists to midnight arrests, from the arrest of Röhm to the executions carried out in cellars and forests, the night revealed the true face of dictatorship. This was not merely the consolidation of a leader, it was the creation of a totalitarian state, one that would soon drag Europe into the bloodiest war in human history. And tonight, we go back into those fateful hours, tracing the roots of ambition, fear, betrayal, and power, as they intertwined in a story as chilling as it is decisive. So wherever you are tuning in from, whether it is morning in Europe, evening in America, or midnight in Asia, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you, as we dive into the entire Night of the Long Knives, the purge that cemented Hitler's rise and set the path toward World War. The guns fell silent on the morning of November 11th, 1918, but for Germany, the end of the Great War was less a peace than a humiliation. Across the devastated fields of France and Belgium, the once proud German army retreated in bitterness, not defeated in open battle, but forced into surrender by exhaustion, blockade, and sheer attrition. The nation that had marched into war with dreams of empire now faced the bitter reality of collapse. Soldiers trudged home carrying ragged uniforms, worn boots, and stories of mud, hunger, and shattered comrades. At home, millions of civilians had endured years of scarcity, with bread made from sawdust flour and families freezing through winters without coal. The naval blockade imposed by Britain had strangled Germany's ability to feed itself, leading to malnutrition and disease across its cities. Influenza ravaged the population, compounding grief with sickness in the war's dying months. For many Germans, defeat felt like betrayal, a surrender forced by weak politicians rather than lost battles. This poisonous belief would come to be known as the stab-in-the-back myth, a dangerous idea that would fester in the years ahead. It was the seed from which radicalism would grow. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, delivered a blow that Germany could neither ignore nor easily endure. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, assigned sole responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies, branding the nation as aggressor in the eyes of the world. Reparations demanded by the Allies totaled an astronomical 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it threatened to cripple generations. The German army was dismantled, reduced to 100,000 men, forbidden tanks, heavy artillery, or an air force. The once mighty navy was stripped to a token force, and the submarine fleet scuttled in silent defiance at Scapa Flow. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, the Polish corridor cut through Prussia, and colonies across Africa and the Pacific were seized by victors. Even the Rhineland was demilitarized, leaving Germany's western frontier defenseless and exposed. Each clause of the treaty burned like an open wound, a daily reminder of lost honor and diminished power. German politicians who signed the treaty were branded November criminals, traitors to the nation. For ordinary citizens, Versailles was not peace but punishment. The humiliation of Versailles intertwined with the economic devastation left by war to create a crucible of despair. German industry, once a powerhouse of Europe, lay crippled by blockades, strikes, and the loss of crucial resources. The mark, Germany's currency, wavered under the pressure of reparations, and government printing presses ran endlessly to cover debts. Hyperinflation soon followed, reaching absurd extremes that defied imagination. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks, and families carried wages home in wheelbarrows of useless paper. Life savings evaporated overnight, pensions shrank to nothing, and the middle class, the backbone of stability, was shattered. Farmers refused to sell food for worthless currency, leaving cities hungry while fields remained fertile. Stories spread of children playing with bundles of banknotes as toys, their value less than the paper they were printed on. Out of desperation, many bartered furniture, heirlooms, and even wedding rings for sacks of potatoes. In this chaos, desperation became the daily reality of a defeated people. While Germany starved and struggled, the political world of the Weimar Republic descended into violence and fear. Born from the ashes of monarchy, the Republic promised democracy, but delivered instability, as fragile coalitions collapsed under the weight of crisis. Street battles erupted between the far-left Spartacists, who dreamed of Bolshevik revolution, and the right-wing Freikorps, veterans still armed and eager to fight. In January 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht led a doomed uprising in Berlin, crushed brutally by Freikorps gunfire. The corpses of revolutionaries floated in canals and littered city streets, a grim warning to all who opposed the order. But the Freikorps themselves were no loyal servants of democracy, despising the republic they defended. Across towns and villages, paramilitary groups marched with rifles slung over shoulders, wearing old uniforms with new armbands. The sound of boots on cobblestones replaced the calm of civic life. Germans lived not under the stability of law, but in the shadow of violence. Democracy was fragile, and every faction carried weapons to enforce its vision of Germany's future. These conditions forged a society both weary and volatile, where every grievance seemed to demand radical solutions. Veterans returned from the trenches hardened by years of mechanized slaughter, unable to adapt to civilian life. Their world had been one of artillery barrages, machine gun nests, and comradeship in mud-soaked trenches, and peace felt meaningless by comparison. Many joined paramilitary organizations, where they found purpose in marching, drilling, and fighting for causes that promised glory. For workers and peasants, poverty became unbearable, driving many to the extremes of communism, which promised equality through revolution. For the bourgeoisie, communism meant terror, and they gravitated toward right-wing groups that promised order and tradition. Churches, schools, and newspapers became battlefields of ideology, each side convinced only it could save Germany. Yet beneath all the shouting and violence lay a shared wound, humiliation at Versailles, the sting of defeat, and fear for the nation's survival. This psychological burden bound Germans together in resentment, even as it split them apart politically. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The structure of Weimar democracy only deepened the sense of instability. With proportional representation, dozens of parties competed for seats, making strong governments rare and fragile coalitions the norm. Cabinets rose and fell in rapid succession, leaving policy paralyzed while crisis mounted. Inflation eroded trust in the currency, while endless political infighting eroded trust in democracy itself. To many Germans, Parliament seemed a theatre of bickering rather than a source of solutions. In contrast, those who marched in disciplined ranks on the streets appeared strong, decisive, and united. Propaganda posters promised restoration of honor, dignity, and power, and they drew thousands into their orbit. Politicians seemed weak, men in uniform seemed powerful. It was an illusion, but one that appealed to a population desperate for certainty. In such a climate, extremism thrived not at the margins but at the very center of political life. Amid this turbulence, Germany became a breeding ground for myths and conspiracies that poisoned the national discourse. The most insidious was the claim that Jews, socialists, and Republicans had stabbed Germany in the back, betraying the heroic army. This lie found fertile ground among embittered veterans who could not accept that the battlefield had drained Germany dry. Propagandists painted Jewish businessmen as profiteers of suffering, while communists were cast as agents of Moscow bent on destroying Germany. Old prejudices merged with new fears, creating a culture where scapegoats replaced solutions. Pamphlets, newspapers, and fiery speeches spread these myths from beer halls to university lecture halls. For many struggling to feed their families, such stories offered simple explanations for complex problems. Hatred became a form of comfort, a way to make sense of despair. The poison spread quietly, but it set the stage for more radical voices to rise. In the fog of lies, truth was drowned out by anger. By the early 1920s, the Germany of poets, philosophers, and engineers had become a nation haunted by shadows. Its cities bore scars of strikes and shootings, while its countryside seethed with resentment. Foreign soldiers occupied the Rhineland, a daily reminder of defeat enforced by bayonets and foreign flags. Every schoolchild grew up under the weight of reparations, their futures mortgaged to debts owed to victorious powers. Every family carried stories of hunger, humiliation, or violence. Yet within this suffering emerged both despair and dangerous hope. For radicals of every stripe, the crisis was not an end but an opportunity. They promised rebirth through struggle, order through strength, and vengeance for past wrongs. Among those voices was a failed artist, a decorated corporal from Austria, who found in Germany's chaos his chance to rise. His name was Adolf Hitler, and soon the seeds of radicalism would bear terrifying fruit. In the ruins of post-war Munich, a city torn between hunger and revolution, a discharged soldier named Adolf Hitler began his unlikely ascent. He had no career, no family, and no fortune, only a restless anger and a sense of destiny that seemed absurd to those who knew him. In 1919, the German army, seeking to monitor radical groups, assigned him as a political informant. His task was to infiltrate a small organization called the German Workers' Party, a fringe gathering of nationalists and conspiracy theorists. What began as routine surveillance quickly became a turning point in history. Hitler attended meetings in smoke-filled beer halls, where angry men railed against Jews, communists, and the humiliation of Versailles. He listened, and then, compelled by fury, spoke. His speeches electrified listeners, blending rage with a strange charisma that drew crowds despite his obscurity. For the first time, Hitler discovered his true gift, the ability to move masses with words. It was a weapon far more powerful than any rifle he had carried at the front. The German Workers' Party, soon to be renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, offered a stage for Hitler's voice. He infused its program with ideas that were both borrowed and twisted into something new. Nationalism, fierce and uncompromising, promised to restore Germany's lost greatness. Anti-communism rallied against the spectre of Bolshevism, which many feared would spill over from Russia into Germany's streets. Anti-Semitism, long a current in European prejudice, became central in Hitler's vision, identifying Jews as the hidden enemy behind defeat, depression, and disorder. The party's rhetoric promised unity through exclusion, strength through hatred, and renewal through violence. It was a crude ideology, but it resonated with those who felt betrayed and broken by the Republic. Hitler did not invent these hatreds, but he shaped them into a coherent weapon of politics. Through his oratory, despair was transformed into purpose, and purpose into fanaticism. In the fever of beer halls, the seeds of dictatorship took root. By 1920, the NSDAP had drafted its 25-point program, a manifesto blending radical nationalism with social promises. It called for the unification of all Germans into one Reich, tearing down the boundaries imposed at Versailles. It demanded the abolition of the treaty itself, the return of lost colonies, and the expansion of living space, Lebensraum, to feed the nation. Jews were stripped of citizenship in its clauses, portrayed not as fellow Germans but as outsiders. Workers were offered visions of welfare and protection, carefully balanced with appeals to traditional values. It was a program that blended left and right, confusing critics but appealing to the disillusioned. While elites dismissed it as political theatre, ordinary Germans heard in it the echoes of their frustrations. Posters and leaflets spread the message through Munich, while paramilitary supporters enforced it on the streets. In these years, the Nazi Party began to grow from an obscure circle into a force of agitation. Hitler, increasingly its face, mastered the art of turning resentment into loyalty. The SA, or Sturmabteilung, became the party's muscle, stormtroopers in brown shirts drawn from veterans and restless youths. Armed with pistols, clubs, and discipline forged in street brawls, they defended Nazi rallies and attacked opponents. Munich's beer halls became battlefields, where speeches often ended with shattered glass and blood on the cobblestones. The SA gave the party an aura of strength, projecting order even as it thrived on chaos. To unemployed young men, marching in columns with flags and songs offered belonging that the Republic could not. They carried banners marked with swastikas, a symbol Hitler had chosen to embody movement, struggle, and Aryan destiny. For opponents, the SA was a menace, but for sympathizers, it was a glimpse of reborn German vigor. Their presence magnified Hitler's message, turning words into action, propaganda into force. As crowds swelled, so too did the fear they inspired in rivals. In the violence of these years, the Nazi movement learned how to dominate the streets before it dominated the state. By 1923, the party's growth collided with Germany's national crisis. As hyperinflation reached its nightmarish peak, the Weimar government appeared powerless, while workers demanded solutions and industrialists feared collapse. Hitler saw his chance not in patient politics, but in revolutionary action, inspired by Mussolini's march on Röhm the year before. He believed the time had come to seize power in Bavaria and then sweep across Germany. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers stormed a political meeting in Munich's Burger Brokeller beer hall. With pistol raised, Hitler declared a national revolution, demanding the support of Bavarian leaders. Outside, SA troops took control of streets and barricades, waiting for orders to march. The attempted coup, later called the beer hall putsch, was bold but chaotic, plagued by poor planning and uncertain allies. As dawn broke, police and army units confronted the marchers, and gunfire scattered the rebels. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen lay dead, and Hitler's coup collapsed in failure. Hitler's arrest days later seemed to mark the end of his movement, a fringe uprising crushed before it could spread. Newspapers mocked him as a delusional agitator, and opponents celebrated the fall of a dangerous fanatic. Yet prison would become not his tomb but his forge. At his trial, Hitler transformed the courtroom into a stage, delivering speeches that turned charges of treason into declarations of patriotism. He portrayed himself not as a criminal but as a soldier fighting for Germany's honor against corrupt politicians. Judges sympathetic to nationalist sentiment treated him leniently, sentencing him to 5 years but ensuring comfortable conditions. His performance made headlines across the nation, introducing his name far beyond Bavaria. To those who longed for strength and defiance, Hitler appeared not as a failed rebel but as a man of destiny. Behind prison walls he began to reimagine his path to power. Defeat became lesson, and lesson became strategy. It was during this prison term at Landsberg Fortress that Hitler dictated Mein Kampf, his manifesto of ideology and ambition. Assisted by Rudolf Hess, he poured into its pages a blend of autobiography, racial theory, and political prophecy. He denounced democracy as weakness, praised dictatorship as strength, and envisioned a future empire built on conquest. Jews were described as parasites, communists as mortal enemies, and Slavs as obstacles to German expansion. Every grievance of the German people was twisted into a justification for his vision. Though turgid in style, the book outlined with chilling clarity the goals he would pursue once in power. Few read it seriously at the time, dismissing it as rambling rhetoric, but its ideas would later shape a world war. For Hitler, writing was less about persuasion than self-confirmation, a blueprint for his destiny. When he left prison after barely 9 months, he carried not just freedom, but a plan. In his mind, the failure of the Purge was only the beginning. The reborn Nazi Party that emerged from the mid-1920s was no longer a band of insurgents, but a movement biding its time. Hitler abandoned the path of armed revolt, choosing instead the legal route to power through elections, propaganda, and relentless organization. The lessons of 1923 had taught him that seizing power required legitimacy as well as force. His charisma grew, his speeches drew thousands, and his image was crafted as Germany's savior-in-waiting. The SA rebuilt itself into a mass movement, ready for the day when violence would again be useful. Financiers and industrialists began to take notice, some quietly channeling funds to the party. The swastika, once scrawled on banners in Munich, became a national symbol of defiance. Across Germany, the Nazi Party expanded its cells, infiltrating unions, student groups, and veterans associations. The man dismissed as a failed agitator now stood at the threshold of something far greater. Hitler's rise was no longer a question of if, but when. The collapse of order in Weimar Germany gave birth to a new kind of politics, one fought not only in parliaments but in the streets. The Nazi Party understood early that speeches alone could not survive the fury of hostile crowds. Meetings were often stormed by communists, hecklers, and rival militias, turning debate into chaos. To shield their gatherings, the Nazis organized a body of guards drawn from war veterans and restless youths. This group evolved into the Sturmabteilung, or SA, a storm detachment that carried politics into combat. At first they wore mismatched clothing, but soon surplus brown colonial uniforms were acquired, giving them their infamous name, the Brownshirts. They carried banners with swastikas, marched in tight formation, and sang war songs that echoed through Munich's streets. For Hitler, they were more than guards. They were the visible embodiment of his movement's strength. For Germany, they became the sound of boots that drowned out the voice of democracy. The SA quickly became known not for defense but for aggression, thriving on the violence of Weimar's fractured society. Their tactics were crude yet effective, storming rival rallies, scattering opponents with fists and clubs, silencing speakers with intimidation. Beer halls became arenas of chaos, where every political gathering risked ending in shattered glass and spilled blood. In neighborhoods dominated by communists, Brownshirts marched with drums and torches, daring enemies to resist. Skirmishes broke out in alleys and marketplaces, drawing crowds who watched politics unfold like street theater. Brass knuckles, knives and concealed pistols turned disputes into battles, often with police reluctant to intervene. To supporters, these clashes proved that the Nazis were fighters willing to defend Germany's honor. To opponents, they were terrorists, a mob with uniforms and slogans. Yet through violence, the SA created the image of invincibility, and image was power. At the heart of the SA stood Ernst Röhm, a battle-scarred veteran who embodied both the camaraderie of the trenches and the ruthlessness of paramilitary life. He had fought in the Reichstag and the Freikorps, where loyalty was forged through bloodshed and survival. Röhm envisioned the SA not as a mere guard force, but as the nucleus of a revolutionary army. Where the Treaty of Versailles limited Germany's official army to 100,000 men, Röhm dreamed of millions under brown banners. His personal courage earned respect, for he did not direct from afar, but fought alongside his stormtroopers. Röhm was a man of contradictions, gruff and blunt, openly homosexual in a society of prejudice, yet adored by his men. He built bonds with rank-and-file fighters, who saw him as comrade rather than commander. His friendship with Hitler was close, bound by shared ambition and political need. Under Röhm, the SA swelled in numbers and confidence, more militia than movement. It was a force that believed itself destined to reshape Germany. The men who joined the SA were drawn from the wreckage of war and the despair of unemployment. They were young, restless, and embittered. Veterans who had grown accustomed to rifles and grenades, and civilians who longed for belonging. Marching in columns with flags waving, they rediscovered the discipline and comradeship they had lost when the front dissolved. Uniforms and rituals gave meaning to lives fractured by defeat and poverty. In taverns and meeting halls, they spoke of revenge against enemies within and without. Their chants filled streets with a unity the Republic could not inspire. Communists responded with their own militias, the Red Front Fighters League, and the streets became a battlefield. Each neighborhood bore scars of these clashes, broken windows, bloodstains, sirens echoing too late. For every brawl, the SA grew more confident, feeding on the chaos they helped create. They were not protecting democracy. They were burying it under boots and banners. By design, the SA was organized like an army, with clear ranks, divisions, and commands. Röhm demanded training, discipline, and obedience, shaping his men into a militia that looked like a shadow Reichswehr. In fields and forests outside Munich, stormtroopers drilled with wooden rifles, singing martial songs and imagining the future battles they would fight. Hitler recognized the propaganda value of these displays, turning parades into spectacles of order and power. At rallies, columns of Brownshirts stretched for blocks, saluting as one to their leader. The sheer mass of men gave an impression of inevitability, a movement too large to be stopped. For onlookers, this display suggested a Germany reborn through unity and strength. For Hitler's enemies, it was a warning of violence waiting to erupt. Every march rehearsed the future, where politics would be measured not in debates but in force. The SA became both army and stagecraft, reality and performance intertwined. Weapons were smuggled from old Freikorps arsenals, hidden in barns or carried in secret beneath coats. Clubs, knives, and pistols turned protests into battle zones, where city blocks became contested ground. Stormtroopers knew the terrain of their neighborhoods, the alleys for ambushes, the rooftops for signals, the beer halls for barricades. Police files described riots where revolvers cracked in crowded squares, leaving blood on cobblestones. The violence was not random but deliberate, intended to show that Nazis controlled the streets. Each skirmish reinforced their claim to dominance, while rivals were left bruised, broken, or silenced. By the late 1920s, the SA had swollen into hundreds of thousands, far beyond the size of the official German army. Their power could not be ignored, even by generals who despised them. To ordinary citizens, they represented both protection and threat, depending on allegiance. To Hitler, they were the weapon that forced Germany to notice his movement. But the SA's rise unsettled allies who had helped the Nazis gain respectability. Businessmen feared Röhm's radical talk of a second revolution that might redistribute wealth. Army generals viewed the stormtroopers as undisciplined upstarts who threatened their monopoly on force. Conservative politicians who saw the Nazis as tools began to see them as a menace. Even within the party, figures like Himmler and Goering eyed Röhm's influence with suspicion. Yet for Hitler, the SA remained indispensable, the muscle that transformed rhetoric into reality. Without them, Nazi rallies would be disrupted, their propaganda silenced in fists and blood. With them, the party projected strength that ballots alone could not provide. It was a dangerous balance, one that Hitler managed with care in these early years. The stormtroopers were both the ladder he climbed and the threat that waited at the top. By 1932, the SA had grown into a paramilitary army of more than 3 million men, dwarfing the official Reichswehr 30-fold. Their marches filled cities with rivers of brown, their songs carried the promise of revolution. They no longer saw themselves as protectors of a party, but as the vanguard of a new Germany. Each rally was not only a show of strength, but a rehearsal for power. In the minds of many, the Republic had already lost the streets to the Brownshirts. Fear and admiration spread in equal measure, as ordinary Germans watched the tide of uniforms sweep past their windows. For Röhm's stormtroopers, loyalty to Hitler was absolute, but loyalty to their own commander burned just as fiercely. They imagined themselves the true army of the Reich, ready to overthrow the old order when the time came. The SA had become more than a militia. It was a state within a state, and its rise set the stage for the deadly struggle that would soon decide its fate. In October 1929, the crash of Wall Street sent shockwaves that rippled far beyond the skyscrapers of New York. American loans had been the lifeblood of Germany's fragile recovery, sustaining factories, banks, and the Weimar Republic itself. When the markets collapsed, those loans were recalled, and the German economy crumbled overnight. Businesses shuttered, coal mines stood silent, and machines rusted on factory floors. By 1932, unemployment had soared past 6 million, leaving 1 in 3 workers idle. Families sold furniture for food, soup kitchens overflowed, and men wandered streets with empty lunch pails. Middle-class savings evaporated, and the humiliation of hyperinflation returned in a new form, poverty without end. The Republic, already mistrusted, now appeared incapable of saving its own people. In the silence of despair, cries for change grew louder, and into that silence stepped the Nazis, with voices of certainty where others faltered. The Nazis crafted their message, not as policy but as prophecy, promising salvation to every wounded corner of society. To the unemployed, they vowed jobs through public works, highways, and rearmament, dreams that shimmered against the grey of hunger lines. To farmers, they promised protection from debt and foreign competition, pledging blood and soil as sacred principles. To the middle class, they offered stability, a shield against communism, and a rebirth of German pride. To the youth, restless and angry, they held out banners, uniforms, and a cause that promised greatness. Propaganda depicted Hitler as a man above politics, a leader of destiny, chosen to restore Germany's honor. Posters showed radiant workers, strong farmers, and marching columns beneath swastikas, visions of unity amid collapse. Every word was wrapped in spectacle, amplified by parades, torchlight, and thunderous speeches. Where the Republic offered excuses, the Nazis offered action, and action, even in words, seemed like hope. The middle class, battered by years of crisis, became one of the Nazis' most important allies. Teachers, clerks, and shopkeepers, who had once trusted liberal parties, now turned to the radical promise of order. They had seen their savings vanish in 1923's hyperinflation, only to watch prosperity vanish again in the Depression. Fear of unemployment, fear of communism, and fear of social collapse drove them into Hitler's camp. They longed for security, and Hitler's voice, amplified by microphones and radios, offered certainty. He denounced Marxists, bankers, and corrupt politicians, weaving complex fears into a single enemy. In beer halls, his speeches roused emotions with crescendos that left audiences shouting in unison. To many, the experience felt almost religious, a conversion by words. Membership in Nazi organizations surged, from the Hitler Youth to women's leagues, binding families into the movement. The middle class, once defenders of the Republic, became pillars of its destroyer. Youth were drawn with equal fervor, for they had known only defeat, crisis, and disappointment since birth. Hitler promised them not just jobs, but belonging, purpose, and adventure. Uniforms transformed ordinary boys into soldiers of a cause, and marching songs replaced the emptiness of unemployment. Schools and universities, once bastions of liberal thought, became fertile ground for nationalist clubs. Young men filled the ranks of the SA, eager for action, while young women joined leagues that celebrated motherhood as patriotic duty. Propaganda portrayed them as the vanguard of renewal, a generation untainted by Versailles and Weimar weakness. For many, the choice was stark: despair in jobless streets or pride in brown uniforms beneath swastikas. Hitler understood the power of youth, calling them the living future of Germany. Their energy fueled rallies where torches lit the night sky with fire and chants. It was a movement that captured not just minds but identities. Electoral success soon followed, as despair turned into votes cast for radical solutions. In 1928, the Nazis had won a meager 2.6% of the national vote, dismissed as a fringe party of extremists. By 1930, amid the storm of depression, they surged to 18%, capturing 107 seats in the Reichstag. In July 1932, they became the largest party in Germany, with over 13 million votes and 230 seats. The Reichstag chamber, once a place of debate, now echoed with the chants and discipline of Nazi deputies. They wore uniforms, marched in formation, and transformed Parliament into theatre. The Republic's defenders were stunned, unable to counter a movement that thrived on both ballots and fists. The Nazis framed their victory as destiny fulfilled, not politics played. Every new election brought more legitimacy, every rally more momentum. The march to power was no longer hidden in beer halls, it was written in ballots and shouted in parliaments. Propaganda became the oxygen of this meteoric rise, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, a master of words and spectacle. He flooded cities with posters that framed Hitler as savior, a messiah-like figure whose eyes stared into Germany's future. Radio broadcasts carried speeches into homes, while gramophones replayed Hitler's voice for those who had never seen him in person. Rallies were staged with meticulous choreography, torches flickering against darkness, banners rippling like waves of fire. Every detail, from marching songs to swastika banners, was designed to overwhelm senses and emotions. Goebbels understood that politics was not about persuasion, but about transformation, turning audiences into believers. The Nazi message was simple yet flexible, promising whatever each group most needed to hear. Farmers heard pledges of fair prices, workers heard calls for jobs, and nationalists heard the roar of restored power. Truth mattered less than resonance, and resonance mattered more than reality. In despair, Germans found not facts, but faith. Meanwhile, traditional parties floundered, unable to adapt to the storm of crisis and spectacle. The Social Democrats defended democracy, but appeared powerless against unemployment and violence. The Communists promised revolution but frightened moderates, who feared another Bolshevik terror. Centrists and conservatives bickered, fractured by egos and outdated loyalties. While they debated, the Nazis marched, shouted and organized, filling the void of leadership. Each election was less about policy than about survival, and the Republic was bleeding support. The Reichstag became paralyzed, unable to form stable governments, leaving presidents to rule by emergency decree. For many Germans, democracy itself seemed useless, a failed experiment in endless crisis. The Nazis, by contrast, looked decisive, disciplined, and unstoppable. In weakness of the old, they found strength for the new. By the dawn of 1933, the Nazis had transformed despair into dominance, becoming a national force no one could ignore. Their movement spanned classes, from workers to industrialists, peasants to professors, all bound by promises of revival. They had risen from a fringe group of agitators to the largest political party in Germany, propelled by crisis into legitimacy. The SA's marches filled streets, their chants echoing in towns once indifferent to politics. Hitler, once dismissed as a rabble-rouser, was now a statesman in the eyes of millions. The Republic staggered on, but its heartbeat was faint, drowned beneath the drums of torchlight rallies. For the unemployed, hope now wore a swastika. For the middle class, stability bore Hitler's face. The Depression had not just shattered an economy, it had reshaped a nation's soul, and in the ashes of collapse, a new order was waiting to be born. Germany had found its false redeemer, and his time was at hand. The early 1930s in Germany resembled a chessboard left in the rain, pieces slicked, fortunes shifted, and every move uncertain. Economy, politics, and public trust were frayed so thinly that a single misstep could topple governments. Indeed, chancellors came and went with bewildering speed. Markets trembled, banks hesitated, and millions watched their livelihoods evaporate, while the streets grew louder with uniforms and slogans. President Paul von Hindenburg, a conservative icon of the old imperial order, refused to restore a military dictatorship outright, but relied increasingly on emergency decrees to hold the Republic together. Political gravity pulled toward the extremes, on one side hungry communists, who wanted revolution, and on the other a swelling nationalist right that promised order through force. Within this maelstrom, conservative elites, landowners, industrial magnates, and army leaders grew desperate to find a solution that would crush radical leftism and restore stability. They feared mass strikes, factory seizures, and the spread of Bolshevik terror to German streets, memories vivid from the Russian Revolution and German uprisings of 1918-19. For many of these elites, parliamentary democracy had become an obstacle, rather than a virtue, too slow and too weak to save their interests. So they looked for a figure who could command the masses while preserving their privileges, a leader who could be guided, they believed, from behind the scenes. That desire would be decisive in the months to come, as deals were struck in drawing rooms, and reputations were gambled away for the promise of order. Franz von Papen, a devout aristocrat with a taste for courtly intrigue, became the principal architect of a dangerous bargain. Having briefly served as Chancellor in 1932, he resented being sidelined and sought a return to power by any means necessary. Papen believed he could tame Hitler by offering him the chancellorship inside a cabinet dominated by conservative ministers who would hold real authority. He argued that the Nazi movement could be harnessed to break leftist power in the Reichstag, and that Hitler's mass appeal would bring stability without overthrowing elite rule. Kurt von Schleicher, the intriguer general and former chancellor, maneuvered between rival factions, trying to build a coalition that would exclude both Hitler and the communists. Meanwhile, President Hindenburg, old, proud, and intent on preserving the old order, listened as advisors, officers, and even his son Oscar pressed him toward accommodation with radical nationalists. Behind closed doors, Papen cultivated contacts with industrialists, bankers, and conservative politicians, promising to bind Hitler with ministerial checks and aristocratic restraint. They imagined a government in which Hitler supplied the votes and the street power, while experienced elites supplied policy, finance, and restraint. These calculations rested on a fatal misreading. They underestimated Hitler's skill at seizing both the stage and the strings of power that others thought they still controlled. The conspirators' gamble culminated in secret meetings, whispered promises, and the casting of lots with Germany's future, moves that historians later traced as the decisive betrayal of the Republic. Encyclopaedia Britannica. Industrial titans watched strikes and bank runs like doctors watching a fevered patient, convinced that systemic collapse would devour capital and order alike. They feared communism above all, for seizing factories and land would wipe out decades of investment and social standing. The army's high command, humiliated by Versailles yet protective of its professional prestige, refused to be replaced by a mass militia of SA stormtroopers. Generals wanted order without revolution, discipline without demagoguery, and they quietly signaled to conservative politicians that a managed nationalist government might be tolerable. Bankers whispered that a strong hand could stabilize credit, that orderly markets would return if political violence were suppressed by someone with popular backing. In smoky rooms where the clink of cognac glasses accompanied schemes, the elites reasoned that Hitler could be the instrument to achieve this, a useful popular face for an authoritarian managed state. These men, stoic, risk-averse, convinced by status and history, failed to see that once they enlisted mass politics, the mass would no longer be their tool but an autonomous force. Their calculations had texture, promises of cabinet seats, assurances that the conservative bloc could veto radical measures, and the appeal of short-term stability over long-term uncertainty. For ordinary workers and small shopkeepers who entered city halls to witness this drama, the negotiations were invisible. What they saw was only a figure on the radio promising work and dignity. Thus the elite's pact with populism was sealed as a pragmatic answer to panic, a trade in which they believed they sold danger for control. Hitler approached the bargain with the cold pragmatism of a showman who understood both spectacle and substance. He accepted the role of Chancellor in a cabinet that, on paper, limited his power, but in practice would give him the platform he needed. Inside his mind, holding formal office was the first step, transforming institutions, coercing opponents, and exploiting legal levers were the next. On January 30th, 1933, after weeks of backroom negotiation and pressure from conservative circles, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The moment was staged. Carriages, cameras, and a handful of photographers captured Hitler's procession through Berlin, lending the event the gravitas of legitimacy. Papen took the vice-chancellorship, convinced that he had trapped the rabble-rouser inside a framework of conservative oversight. Hitler, newly installed, moved with deliberate calm, knowing that the machinery of state, ministries, police forces, and bureaucracies could be turned to his advantage. He promised moderation in public and plotted transformation in private, using the legal standing of his office to reshape the Republic's rules. Many Germans who watched the newsreels believed a return to order was possible, that tumult would be replaced by authoritative governance. Yet the legal veneer of the appointment masked the fast occurrence of consolidation that would sweep aside opposition in weeks and months to come. Encyclopaedia Britannica. It is essential to remember that the Nazis never initially commanded an outright parliamentary majority. They were a force that grew through both ballots and intimidation. In July 1932, riding the crest of economic despair and street spectacle, the Nazi Party won 230 seats and became the largest party in the Reichstag. Their showing terrified centrists and emboldened extremists, making coalition building nearly impossible and polarizing the parliament. A few months later, in November 1932, their vote share slipped, but their presence as the dominant faction was undeniable, a fact that conservative kingmakers would exploit. After Hitler's appointment, the government moved quickly to call fresh elections for March 1933, campaigning under a cloud of both propaganda and threat. Those elections, held after the Reichstag fire and during an atmosphere of emergency, returned the Nazis a dramatically larger share of the seats, 288 deputies, cementing their parliamentary ascendancy. The numbers mattered because they legitimized a government that had seized office through elite bargaining and now sought the law's approval. Each seat was not just wood and paper, but the voiced silence of institutions that had failed to protect themselves. For ordinary voters, the choice felt existential: stability promised by uniforms, or continued chaos that had eaten livelihoods and hope. Thus the Republic's democratic processes were exploited and transformed into the legal architecture of dictatorship. Wikipedia +1. With electoral legitimacy in hand and allies among conservatives, the Nazi government set about using the law to dismantle the law. They used cabinet decrees, emergency powers under Article 48, and police apparatuses to silence rivals while maintaining a facade of legality. The Prussian police, placed increasingly under Nazi loyalists such as Hermann Göring, were reoriented to surveil and break opposition rather than protect pluralism. Propaganda flooded the airwaves and streets. Goebbels engineered campaigns that mixed fear with promises, while local police turned a blind eye to SA violence. Trade unions were demonized, their leaders arrested, and work councils replaced with Nazi-controlled labor fronts. Opposition newspapers were censored or shuttered, and bureaucrats who hesitated to carry out orders were warned or removed. The Gestapo and SS, still small but growing, began to compile dossiers on socialists, communists, and liberal elites for swift action. Meanwhile, the judiciary, long deferential to authority, slowly adapted to the new order by accepting emergency decrees as normal governance. For ordinary citizens, the legal-sounding decrees felt like final answers: arrests without trial, bans on meetings, and the sudden disappearance of critics. The Nazis' genius lay in turning the apparatus of the state into a weapon, using statutes and spectacles together to make repression appear lawful. The turning point came with the Reichstag fire at the end of February 1933, an event that the regime immediately portrayed as the opening salvo of a communist uprising. Within hours, Hitler seized the moment to demand drastic measures, insisting that the nation required emergency powers to preserve order and property. Using the president's authority, the government issued a sweeping decree that suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, and the press were effectively curtailed overnight. Arrests ballooned. Known communists and socialists were rounded up and held in protective custody, without the need for formal charges. In this atmosphere of fear, the March 5th elections were conducted with intimidation as a constant backdrop, and with the KPD unable to campaign freely. Less than 3 weeks later, on March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, a law that allowed Hitler's cabinet to enact legislation without parliamentary consent, and effectively nullified democratic checks. The Enabling Act required a 2/3 majority and was secured only through a mixture of political deals, the exclusion of communist deputies, and the tangible presence of SA and SS forces outside the chamber. Once enacted, it provided Hitler with the legal authority to rewrite the state, dissolve parties, and outlaw opposition under the pretense of emergency rule. Historians view this law as the legal linchpin that converted the Weimar Republic's institutions into instruments of authoritarian governance. What began as elite bargaining had been transformed into a bureaucratic machinery of repression, now dressed in legality and backed by the state's coercive organs. Encyclopaedia Britannica. From that point, consolidation proceeded with eerie efficiency. Gleichschaltung, the synchronization of society to Nazi aims, became the word for the purge of pluralism. Trade unions were smashed, their assets seized and leaders imprisoned, replaced by a state-controlled labor front that eliminated independent worker organization. State governments were reshaped, lender parliaments dissolved, and civil servants swore new oaths of loyalty that made profession indistinguishable from political fealty. Jewish professionals found their licenses revoked, students expelled, and cultural life sanitized as institutions bent to ideological conformity. Local mayors and police chiefs who resisted were removed, replaced by party functionaries who knew how to follow orders with brutal punctuality. Those who spoke out, journalists, theologians, and academics, were threatened with prison or exile, their names crossed off lists that would one day be dossiers for cruelty. Every law, every decree, every oath rewired society, turning bureaucratic procedures into rail tracks that led inexorably toward total control. For families who had hoped that a conservative government would restore stability without terror, the reality was a slow and inexorable forfeiture of rights. By the end of 1933, the machinery of state, party, and secret police had been welded together, and opposition had been driven underground or into exile. Hitler had achieved what the conservative elites had bargained for, order and authority, but they had lost the ability to restrain the monster they had helped to feed. On the cold evening of February 27th, 1933, Berlin's night sky was suddenly pierced by flames leaping from the Reichstag, the parliament building that symbolized the struggling democracy. Witnesses described the glow as visible across the city, smoke rising like a funeral shroud over the republic itself. Fire brigades rushed with hoses and ladders, but the blaze consumed the wooden galleries and chamber ceilings too quickly to be contained. Inside, portraits of past leaders blackened, documents turned to ash, and the chamber floor cracked under collapsing beams. Police found a lone figure within the building, Marinus van der Lubbe, a young Dutch communist, half naked, carrying incendiary materials, dazed from exhaustion. His arrest provided the regime with a culprit almost too convenient, a man whose politics and foreign birth fit Nazi narratives perfectly. As crowds gathered to watch the inferno, Goebbels and other Nazi leaders seized the moment, declaring it the opening strike of a communist revolution. The fire was less a tragedy than an opportunity, a pretext to tighten control and ignite fear. Ordinary Berliners whispered of plots and uprisings, uncertain who to believe, but certain that nothing would be the same again. The flames did not just destroy a building, they illuminated the path toward dictatorship. The Nazi leadership moved with astonishing speed, framing the fire as proof of a vast Marxist conspiracy. Hitler himself, summoned to the scene, raged before reporters that Germany faced mortal peril, and that decisive action was now unavoidable. Goering, already Minister of the Interior for Prussia, ordered police to storm communist offices and arrest thousands of activists, often with little more than suspicion as evidence. Within hours, the party machine produced posters, radio announcements, and headlines screaming of Red Terror. The timing was crucial, for just 1 week remained before national elections, and panic could drive wavering voters into Nazi arms. In reality, no evidence of a coordinated communist uprising ever materialized, but perception mattered more than truth. The Reichstag fire, whether act of lone arson or orchestrated provocation, became a psychological turning point. Germans who feared unemployment now also feared revolution, and many accepted that only the Nazis offered protection. Street violence that had once seemed part of politics now appeared as a prelude to civil war. Fear was weaponized, and fear proved to be the strongest ally Hitler ever had. The very next day, on February 28, 1933, President Hindenburg, under Hitler's urging, signed the Reichstag fire decree, officially titled the Decree for the Protection of People and State. It suspended the most basic civil liberties enshrined in the Weimar Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, once cornerstones of democracy, were stripped away with a stroke of a pen. Police were granted the power to conduct searches without warrants, seize property, and detain individuals indefinitely without charges. Overnight, Germany's fragile democracy became a police state in form, if not yet in name. SA and SS squads worked hand in glove with police to raid homes, smash printing presses, and haul political opponents to improvised cells. For those arrested, often without trial, imprisonment was not days but months, a limbo of intimidation and abuse. Judges, long deferential to authority, upheld the decree as lawful, providing legal cover for repression. The public, many exhausted by years of crisis, welcomed the measure as necessary security. In truth, it was the death sentence of liberty, disguised as protection. The arrests came in waves, sweeping through cities and villages alike, uprooting the Republic's defenders with terrifying efficiency. Communists bore the brunt, with their parliamentary deputies barred from campaigning, their presses silenced, and their meetings banned. By election day, the Communist Party was a husk, its leaders imprisoned, its activists hunted like criminals, but the net widened quickly, ensnaring social democrats, trade unionists, and anyone suspected of resisting Nazi rule. Police stations filled beyond capacity, forcing authorities to improvise new detention facilities. Old barracks, warehouses, and even stables were converted into holding cells, precursors to the camps that would define the regime's brutality. In the SA's hands, protective custody meant beatings, humiliation, and torture, all carried out with impunity. Families waited outside stations for news, often receiving only silence or the return of a broken body. Fear spread not only among radicals, but among moderates, who realized the Republic no longer protected its citizens. By silencing opponents before ballots were cast, the Nazis ensured democracy would end with the illusion of legality. The elections of March 5, 1933, were conducted under this shadow of fear, intimidation, and suppression. Nazi propaganda dominated the streets, plastering walls with Hitler's stern gaze, while SA units marched to intimidate voters. Opposition parties, harassed and restricted, struggled to reach the public, while newspapers carried only censored voices or Nazi-approved slogans. Despite this, the Nazis fell short of an outright majority, winning 43.9% of the vote and 288 seats in the Reichstag. Yet, with their nationalist allies, they controlled enough power to dominate the chamber. For Hitler, this was sufficient, for legality could now serve as the cloak for dictatorship. He proclaimed victory as a mandate, ignoring the battered condition in which the electorate had been forced to choose. The people's voice had been coerced, but the numbers were all that mattered in the narrative of triumph. With Parliament fractured and opposition silenced, the stage was set for the final blow to democracy. The Reichstag that had burned in flames would now be burned in law. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag convened in Berlin's Kroll Opera House, the original chamber still scarred from the fire. The deputies entered under the watchful eyes of SA and SS guards stationed outside, their uniforms a reminder of the stakes. Inside, banners hung with swastikas replaced the old symbols of the Republic, turning the assembly into a theatre of power. Hitler stood before the chamber, delivering a speech that blended reassurance with menace, promising national renewal while warning of chaos if powers were denied. The Enabling Act, formerly the law to remedy the distress of people and Reich, was presented as a temporary measure to stabilize Germany. In reality, it granted the cabinet authority to pass laws without parliamentary approval, effectively erasing checks and balances. Communist deputies were already absent, their seats vacant due to arrests, while Social Democrats faced jeers and threats from stormtroopers. To reach the required two-thirds majority, Hitler relied on the intimidation of deputies and the support of Catholic centrists, won by vague promises of religious protection. The vote passed overwhelmingly, 444 to 94, with only the Social Democrats in open defiance. It was not just a law, it was the surrender of democracy to dictatorship. The passage of the Enabling Act transformed Hitler's chancellorship from precarious coalition into absolute power. Overnight, Parliament was reduced to irrelevance, its deputies stripped of real authority, its debates a hollow ritual. Cabinet decrees carried the force of law, signed by Hitler's hand and enacted without opposition. State governments were quickly dissolved, trade unions banned, and political parties outlawed, leaving the Nazis as the sole legal force in German politics. The press, already muzzled, became little more than a megaphone for propaganda. Judges, teachers, and civil servants swore loyalty not to the Constitution, but to the Fuhrer. For the SA and SS, the moment confirmed their role as enforcers of the new order, wielding power with arrogance and brutality. Ordinary Germans watched as familiar institutions melted away, replaced by slogans, oaths, and symbols of the new regime. Some cheered, some despaired, but all understood that something irreversible had taken place. The Third Reich had been born not in revolution, but in the quiet signing of laws. By spring of 1933, the Republic was dead, extinguished not by foreign invasion, but by its own elected representatives and legal decrees. The Reichstag fire had provided the terror, the decree had supplied the repression, and the Enabling Act had delivered the final authority. From this fusion of fear and legality emerged a dictatorship cloaked in constitutional form, its violence justified as necessity, its power proclaimed as destiny. For Hitler, the journey from agitator to absolute ruler had taken little more than a month. Conservative elites who believed they could control him now found themselves sidelined, watching as the man they underestimated remade the state. Opposition leaders languished in prisons or fled into exile, their voices drowned by marching boots and roaring crowds. The machinery of government, once designed to serve citizens, was now a weapon aimed against them. Germany had entered a new era where dissent was treason, and loyalty meant submission to one man's will. The flames that consumed the Reichstag had lit the path into darkness. By 1933, the SA had swelled into a mass movement numbering in the millions, dwarfing the official Reichswehr a dozen times over. Their parades filled boulevards with endless columns of brown shirts, drums beating and flags snapping like thunder in the wind. They drilled in schoolyards, practiced maneuvers in fields, and turned marketplaces into stages for their marches. For unemployed men, the uniform was more than cloth. It was identity, dignity, and belonging. In villages, they patrolled streets, intimidating critics, and forcing taverns to echo with Nazi songs. To civilians, their presence was inescapable, a constant reminder that politics now belonged to men in boots. The stormtroopers exuded the confidence of victors, convinced they were Germany's true army in waiting. Every gathering became a show of force, overwhelming local authorities who lacked the will to resist. Even skeptics admitted that the sight of their disciplined ranks suggested inevitability. The Republic was gone, and the SA strutted openly upon its grave. At their helm was Ernst Röhm, scarred veteran and prophet of a new order, who saw the SA not as an auxiliary but as destiny. He called for a second revolution, a purge of privilege that would smash not only Marxists but conservatives, aristocrats and industrialists. Röhm imagined his millions of stormtroopers replacing the old Reichswehr, creating a people's army born of trenches and streets. He scorned generals as relics of a defeated empire, mocking their rigid traditions and Versailles shackles. His men adored him, for he marched with them, brawled with them, and drank with them in smoky beer halls. Röhm's bluntness, his defiance of convention, even his open homosexuality, did little to diminish his authority among the rank and file. His speeches promised equality for fighters, a Germany forged by those who bled, not those who schemed. Stormtroopers imagined themselves as future officers, generals of a revolutionary army. To them, Röhm was not a politician, but a comrade in arms with a vision as vast as their ambition. For Hitler, this devotion was both invaluable and increasingly dangerous. The Reichswehr viewed this growing giant with cold suspicion, for though it was small, it held the monopoly of true power. With just 100,000 men, it remained disciplined, professional, and armed with weapons hidden in defiance of Versailles. Its officers bore the weight of tradition, men who had commanded at Verdun, Tannenberg, and the Somme. To them the SA were rabble, undisciplined mobs, unworthy of calling themselves soldiers. They watched parades with disdain, seeing not precision but chaos, not comradeship but drunken swagger. Yet they knew numbers mattered, and Röhm's millions could not be ignored. In meetings with Hitler, generals demanded assurances that their authority would not be usurped. They warned that the Reichswehr would never submit to being replaced by a political militia. The standoff was clear: discipline against mass, tradition against revolution, professionalism against populist force. Hitler stood uneasily between two armies whose rivalry could undo his fragile regime. Business leaders and conservative elites shared the general's anxiety, for Röhm's rhetoric struck at their wealth and privilege. Industrialists had supported Hitler, expecting protection from communism, not threats of redistribution. Aristocrats, heirs of Prussian estates, heard echoes of Bolshevism in Röhm's demands for equality and social upheaval. Even Catholic leaders worried that his radicalism would destabilize the order they had bargained for. Ministers within the party, Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, fed these fears, each seeing in Röhm's fall an opportunity for their own rise. To them, Röhm was not just reckless but a rival, dangerous precisely because of his closeness to Hitler. Pamphlets circulated, whispers spread, and reports of stormtrooper excess reached Berlin. Tales of drunken violence, of SA men acting as lords of their towns, eroded patience among allies. For the establishment, Röhm's army was no longer a shield but a storm that threatened to sweep them away. Pressure on Hitler mounted from all sides, demanding resolution. Meanwhile, SA life thrived in spectacle and violence, reshaping Germany's daily rhythm. They patrolled towns, stormed union halls, and harassed Jews and socialists in public squares. In taverns, they enforced loyalty with fists, ensuring that only Nazi songs filled the air. In universities, they recruited restless students, promising belonging in a Germany reborn through struggle. Farmers welcomed their marches as proof of protection, even as they bristled at their arrogance. Weapons were carried openly, clubs, knives, pistols, symbols of authority, as much as tools of intimidation. Stormtroopers treated their uniforms as second skin, wearing them on trains, in churches, even at family dinners. Children saluted them, shopkeepers feared them, and neighbors joined them to avoid harassment. The SA was no longer confined to rallies. It was woven into the fabric of public life. For millions, brown shirts were not a symbol. They were the law. Hitler's loyalty to Röhm complicated the crisis, for their bond reached back to prison cells and failed revolutions. Röhm had stood beside him in Munich in 1923, sharing bullets, defeat, and incarceration. They called each other friends in a movement where friendship often meant survival. Hitler admired Röhm's blunt courage. Röhm admired Hitler's vision, and their comradeship seemed unbreakable. For months, Hitler defended him, dismissing complaints as exaggerations or jealousy. Yet reports multiplied, each detailing stormtrooper arrogance, corruption, and ambition beyond their station. Hitler realized that protecting Röhm endangered his alliances with generals and industrialists he desperately needed. Each delay risked alienating the conservative foundation upon which his dictatorship still rested. Friendship had become a liability and sentiment a danger. Hitler's dilemma sharpened into a question of survival. By 1934, Germany was balanced precariously between two armies, the legal Reichswehr and the revolutionary SA. Röhm's men, drunk on numbers, dreamed openly of replacing the generals, of commanding the future wars of conquest. The Reichswehr, disciplined and wary, refused to bow, threatening resignation or revolt if Hitler sided with Röhm. Industrialists whispered of withdrawing support, diplomats feared instability, and ministers sharpened their intrigues. Himmler and Göring fed Hitler reports of conspiracies, painting Röhm as a traitor in waiting. Röhm, confident in his friendship with Hitler, dismissed the warnings as political maneuvering. But stormtroopers bragged too loudly, their arrogance recorded and relayed to Berlin. Every day the pressure grew heavier, every week the decision more urgent. The question was no longer if Hitler would act, but when. The storm could not be allowed to rage unchecked. The sea's rise, once the ladder of Hitler's ascent, had become the greatest threat to his power. Röhm's dream of a second revolution clashed fatally with the promises Hitler had made to the army and elites. Millions of stormtroopers, proud and loyal, never suspected that their strength had sealed their fate. The Reichswehr waited, calculating its position, while conservative leaders pressed harder for resolution. Hitler hesitated, torn between loyalty to a friend and necessity to survive. But hesitation had a deadline, for the storm grew louder with every march. Germany stood on the edge of a reckoning that would decide whether Röhm's army lived or died. In the end, the choice would be written not in speeches, but in blood. The expanding SA had reshaped Germany, but its very power demanded its destruction. The storm would soon be broken by the man it had carried to triumph. The Reichswehr in the early 1930s was small by modern standards but enormous in prestige, a compact professional force limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men. Its officer corps was steeped in Prussian discipline and staffcraft, where map rooms, timetables, and logistics mattered more than slogans and street spectacles. Though forbidden tanks, heavy artillery, and an air arm, the army preserved doctrine, maintained caches of equipment, and ran clandestine training to keep competency alive. Training grounds outside Berlin and in East Prussia became careful classrooms of maneuver, where NCOs taught the hard science of combined action and supply. In officer messes and country estates, veterans of the Great War recounted campaigns at Verdun and Tannenberg, forging an ethos that prized order and competence over mass politics. For thousands of ordinary Germans, the Reichswehr symbolized continuity and honor, the last institutional bulwark of national dignity after Versailles' humiliation. Generals thought in railheads and depot security rather than slogans. They worried about mobilization timetables and the integrity of supply lines if politicized violence spread. That professional focus made them suspicious of any body that claimed soldiering without its burdens, logistics, maintenance, and doctrine. Beneath the polished boots and oak-paneled clubs lay a corps ready to act if its institutional survival was threatened. This professional pride set the stage for the confrontation to come. The army's relationship with the Republic and with conservative elites was a blend of reluctant acceptance and careful calculation, for officers tolerated democracy only while their autonomy remained intact. President Hindenburg, an imperial figure and former field marshal, embodied the link between old military prestige and the fragile new state the generals would reluctantly sustain. The High Command accepted governments as instruments for stability, not as masters of military prerogative, and they watched the brown-shirted spectacle with increasing alarm. To the Reichswehr, the essential problem was not ideology alone, but the breakdown of clear command. A parallel militia with political loyalties threatened to usurp orders in a crisis. In staff rooms they sketched worst-case charts, garrison commanders coaxed away by propaganda, rail timetables disrupted by street fighting, depots looted by mass mobs, scenarios where professional planning would be meaningless. Their calculus was technical and existential. An army must be able to concentrate, supply, and maintain morale. A politicized mass undermined each pillar. They therefore leaned on ministers and aristocratic patrons to insist that militias be subordinated or eliminated. The army's aim was to secure its monopoly on organized violence without appearing as a political usurper. That institutional instinct hardened into impatience with Röhm's ambitions and the SA's swagger. The general's position would soon become the decisive pressure on Hitler's choices. From the Reichswehr's vantage, the SA presented an odd paradox. Terrifying in size, yet shallow in military substance. A mass that could dominate streets, but not sustain modern combat operations. Millions of stormtroopers marched in columns and filled public squares, but few had the training to read maps, maintain guns, or coordinate artillery and engineers. Their tactics were brutal and improvisational, ambushes, mobs, and intimidation, effective for political suppression, but catastrophic on a mechanized battlefield that depended on logistics and combined arms. The SA's weapons were often crude: truncheons, pistols, aging rifles, and the occasional rifle salvaged from post-war caches, whereas the Reichswehr guarded heavy guns, engineers, and the technical know-how to employ them. This asymmetry allowed generals to dismiss the SA as militarily inferior while still fearing its political potency. Staff officers produced tabletop exercises showing how poorly trained masses could cause friendly casualties and logistical collapse if misused. Still, for a population that had tasted defeat and humiliation, sheer numbers in uniform had a psychological force that generals could not easily counter. The SA's presence therefore created a dangerous dual reality: political dominance without military substance, and military substance without popular mass. That contradiction tightened the noose around Germany's fragile institutions. The army's concern was less romantic than practical. It could not build a modern military if a politicized militia dictated domestic life. Senior officers moved from suspicion to action, pressing conservative ministries and court circles to constrain the SA before it became irreversible. They used personal networks, connections in aristocratic salons, industrial boardrooms, and the presidential household to press their case in Berlin. Their warnings were clear and sober: either the SA be subordinated to military authority, or the Reichswehr would consider steps to defend its institutional prerogatives. These were not idle threats. Generals spoke in terms of resignations, refusals to execute mobilization orders, and the strategic withholding of expert advice in matters of defense. For ministers who relied on technical competence to plan rearmament, the prospect of losing the army's cooperation was terrifying. Industrialists, who eyed contracts and the restoration of industry, feared political rupture would scare away capital and disrupt production. Diplomats privately fretted that a state split between party militias and a professional army would lack credibility abroad and invite foreign misjudgment. The generals' tactic was patient pressure rather than open revolt. They sought to leverage their indispensable role in national security to obtain guarantees. That strategic choice converted military competence into political muscle. Hitler could not ignore an institution whose support undergirded any plan for rearmament or foreign adventurism. Hitler recognized the Reichswehr as the single instrument he could not replace. Without it, his ambitions for rearmament and territorial revision would remain fantasies. He therefore set out to placate the generals publicly while managing the SA's energies privately, an improvisational balancing act that relied on personal diplomacy and theatrical concessions. He praised the army's professionalism in speeches, invited officers to inspect parades, and offered symbolic deference to military tradition to soothe a wary leadership. Simultaneously, he allowed the SA to retain its ranks and pageantry because it was the visible backbone of his domestic movement and a practical tool for intimidating opponents. This double strategy required deft promises, assurances that the Reichswehr's primacy in matters of defense would remain intact, while the SA's public role would be tolerated but not allowed to supplant formal command. Hitler rebuked Röhm in private conferences, urging restraint while avoiding explicit curbs that would alienate the stormtroopers. He also cultivated relationships with conservative ministers and industrial patrons to show the army that their interests were protected. Every conversation was a calculated performance: flattery here, threats there, ambiguous commitments delivered with a smile. His aim was clear: buy time and loyalty from competing power centers until a more decisive solution could be found. The stakes could not have been higher. A mistake would doom both domestic control and any future foreign policy. The human dimension of this institutional crisis was stark. Junior officers faced humiliation, while senior commanders maneuvered in marble halls, and rank-and-file soldiers fretted about what loyalties would be demanded of them. Captains in provincial garrisons told of SA contingents marching on parade grounds, a spectacle that bruised professional pride and tested obedience to civilian orders. NCOs, the backbone of any military, watched inexperienced stormtroopers swagger with weapons, yet fail to maintain even basic discipline and equipment, worrying that battlefield cohesion would be lost. Families of soldiers whispered anxieties at kitchen tables, imagining sons drafted into politicized violence or ostracized for resisting party fervor. In officer clubs, toasts to honor were mixed with grim conversation about possible resignations, recall plans, and contingency deployments. Some younger officers took to hedging, informally courting party patrons to preserve careers if the political tide turned. Others quietly refined mobilization sketches and posted trusted commanders in key garrisons, preparing to act if legality broke down. These personal choices, made in basements and mess halls, shaped the institutional posture of an army that would soon find itself forced to take a side. The crisis thus threaded through lives as well as doctrine. The professional world of the Reichswehr was being remade by politics. Every small decision by officers and ministers helped determine the course of the nation. By mid-1934, the pressure had crystallized. Generals demanded concrete guarantees that the SA would be subordinated or curtailed, and industrial and conservative backing for the regime hinged on that assurance. The Reichswehr argued that meaningful rearmament and international respect required a single, disciplined military authority unentangled with party militias, and they framed their case in technical language generals understood: mobilization rates, training cycles, and logistic reliability. Hitler's opponents among conservatives used the generals' demands as leverage, insisting that continued support and legitimacy depended on curtailing Röhm's excesses. The army's leverage lay in its monopoly on heavy weapons and the technical apparatus of war. It could make rearmament plans dead on arrival by passive resistance or public withdrawal. For Hitler, losing that cooperation meant sacrificing not only domestic control, but the strategic foundation for future foreign policy. The conflict therefore became a game of high-stakes bargaining, a showdown where the Reichswehr's quiet menace had the power to determine policy without a single battle being fought. The generals did not shout in the streets. They moved through networks of influence and the machinery of state, and their calm insistence carried a terrible weight. The balance of power had shifted from numbers in the plaza to the technical mastery of war. The clock was ticking toward a decision that would reshape the regime. In the end, the Reichswehr, SED conflict, distilled the essential contradiction of Hitler's coalition: mass politics and revolutionary energy on one side, professional hierarchy and technical capability on the other. Hitler's delicate balancing act, placating Röhm while placating the generals, could not be sustained indefinitely. Each concession to one side inflamed the other. The army's quiet authority and control over the instruments of war gave it leverage that would force a resolution, but the manner of that resolution would bind the generals ever closer to Hitler's rule. The stakes were not merely institutional, but strategic. Without the Reichswehr's expertise, Germany could not rearm credibly or project force beyond its borders. Conversely, without the SA's mass, the party's domestic hegemony might be fragile and unstable. This impossible tension set the scene for a violent denouement, a confrontation that would use legal pretexts, secret orders, and midnight arrests to settle the question by force. The coming resolution would preserve the army's technical primacy while transforming its relationship to the Fuhrer into one of personal loyalty, rather than independent professional guardianship. That transformation would make future aggression possible, for the army's competence was now welded to a regime whose legitimacy rested on terror and obedience. The conflict had been won tactically by the generals, but it exacted a moral and political cost that would echo across Europe. As Hitler consolidated power in the early 1930s, the Nazi Party itself became a battlefield of ambition, rivalry, and suspicion. Beneath the veneer of unity, senior leaders jostled for influence, each maneuvering to shape the regime's future in their own image. Ernst Röhm, with his millions of stormtroopers, embodied revolutionary energy and the threat of social upheaval. Hermann Goering, decorated war hero and minister of Prussia, coveted prestige and saw himself as the indispensable statesman of the movement. Heinrich Himmler, quiet and meticulous, expanded his small but disciplined SS into a rival force designed to outshine the unruly SA. Joseph Goebbels, master of propaganda, understood that perception could decide power as surely as armies. Each man whispered to Hitler, presenting himself as the truest guardian of his vision. Behind closed doors, friendships frayed and suspicions deepened, for loyalty in the Nazi hierarchy was always provisional. Hitler, ever the manipulator, allowed rivalries to fester, believing they kept his subordinates dependent and divided. But the tensions grew so sharp that even he could not indefinitely balance them without blood. Himmler's rise was the most unexpected, for the SS began as a small guard unit tasked with protecting Hitler's person. In its early years it numbered only a few hundred men, carefully selected for loyalty, discipline, and ideological purity. Himmler shaped the SS into a cult of obedience, requiring members to undergo background checks, racial vetting, and relentless drilling. Where Röhm's stormtroopers were raucous and undisciplined, Himmler's black-shirted men projected an aura of order and menace. Their uniforms gleamed, their boots shone, and their rituals, oath ceremonies, and runic symbols gave them the sheen of mysticism. Himmler presented the SS not merely as soldiers but as a knightly order, a new aristocracy of the Reich, bound by faith in Hitler. Small though it was, the SS won admiration from conservatives who distrusted the SA's drunken violence and radical talk. Himmler carefully expanded his influence by courting police chiefs, bureaucrats, and traditional elites, promising discipline where Röhm threatened revolution. By 1934, the SS had grown into tens of thousands, still smaller than the SA but elite in reputation. In its quiet precision, Hitler saw a tool that might one day counterbalance the stormtroopers' uncontrollable mass. Göring, meanwhile, built his empire through the machinery of state, using his position as Prussian Interior Minister to command police forces and economic levers. He was flamboyant where Himmler was reserved, appearing in decorated uniforms heavy with medals, charming industrialists, and basking in public adoration. Göring understood that raw power required institutional bases, police, bureaucracy, and access to resources. Under his command, Prussia became a fortress of Nazi authority, with police reorganized into political enforcers loyal to him personally. He cultivated friendships among business magnates, reassuring them that their wealth was safe under his stewardship, even as Röhm spoke of social revolution. Göring also eyed control over the air force that would one day be rebuilt, seeing himself as Germany's modern warlord of the skies. In the rivalries that cut across the regime, he positioned himself as indispensable, the man who could guarantee order and prosperity. Yet his flamboyance and ambition made him both admired and distrusted by fellow Nazis, who saw in him a rival as dangerous as Röhm. Hitler exploited this, praising Göring's loyalty while quietly curbing his reach when it threatened to outshine his own. The stage was crowded with ambitious men, each sharpening their knives in shadow. Joseph Goebbels waged his battles not with armies or police, but with words, images, and sound. His ministry of propaganda turned radios, newspapers, and films into weapons, saturating Germany with a vision of Hitler as savior. Goebbels' genius was his ability to fuse spectacle with message, transforming torchlight rallies into cinematic experiences and speeches into shared national rights. He crafted narratives of unity, power, and destiny, portraying Hitler as a figure beyond politics, while painting enemies as vermin, conspirators, or traitors. Goebbels understood that propaganda did not need to persuade everyone, it only needed to overwhelm, leaving no room for alternatives. Through posters, newsreels, and orchestrated parades, he created an environment where belief felt inevitable and dissent felt futile. His machine magnified every rift within the party, framing Röhm as reckless, Himmler as disciplined, and Göring as indispensable, depending on Hitler's needs. Goebbels' true loyalty lay only with Hitler, for he believed the Fuhrer embodied Germany's destiny in human form. But his propaganda did more than serve Hitler. It also deepened rivalries, amplifying suspicions among ambitious lieutenants. In the echo chamber he built, reality itself bent to political maneuver, and in bending reality, Goebbels became one of Hitler's sharpest weapons. The rivalries between Röhm, Himmler, and Göring were not abstract. They played out in streets, ministries, and barracks. Röhm's stormtroopers swaggered in taverns, boasting they would one day replace generals and ministers alike. Himmler's SS quietly recruited from among disillusioned SA men, offering discipline and honor in place of brawling and drunkenness. Göring's police clashed with stormtroopers in Prussia, each side asserting authority, sometimes with bullets rather than words. Goebbels stoked tensions by highlighting SA excesses in carefully placed rumors, fueling public unease and elite discontent. The result was a party that outwardly displayed unity but seethed with suspicion beneath its banners. Hitler encouraged the competition, believing his lieutenants would expend energy fighting each other instead of challenging him. He positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter, the father figure who decided disputes and commanded obedience. But the risk was real, for Röhm commanded millions, Himmler controlled a growing elite, and Göring wielded the police. If loyalty fractured, Hitler's empire could collapse before it was fully built. The rivalry was both his greatest weapon and his gravest danger. For Röhm, loyalty meant comradeship forged in blood, and he expected Hitler to stand by him as he had in the past. His speeches became increasingly defiant, railing against reactionaries in suits and cowards in ministries, declaring the revolution incomplete. His stormtroopers cheered him as a leader in his own right, a man unafraid to denounce the establishment even within the Nazi movement. But this rhetoric alienated allies and emboldened rivals, giving Himmler and Göring the ammunition they needed to whisper treason in Hitler's ear. Himmler portrayed the SS as the true vanguard of loyalty, free of politics and devoted solely to Hitler. Göring painted himself as indispensable, the guardian of order who could shield the regime from both leftist revolt and SA chaos. Goebbels amplified these messages, reminding Hitler daily that Röhm's ambition threatened to overshadow his own. The propaganda, subtle at first, grew sharper, portraying Röhm as dangerous not just to enemies but to the Fuhrer himself. By 1934, the question of loyalty had crystallized into a choice: Röhm, comrade of old, or the coalition of generals, ministers and rivals. Hitler, ever calculating, began to lean toward necessity over sentiment. Within the party, factions formed, each swearing loyalty, but defining it differently. Röhm's followers pledged loyalty to Hitler through Röhm, believing the SA embodied the revolution Hitler promised. Himmler's SS swore direct loyalty to Hitler alone, an oath repeated with ritual solemnity that bound men as much spiritually as politically. Göring's networks tied loyalty to institutions, the police, the Air Force in embryo, and the economic order he sought to control. Goebbels' machine reinforced Hitler as the supreme arbiter, shaping every faction's image in the eyes of the public. These competing loyalties created a web of intrigue where each man needed Hitler yet maneuvered to weaken the others. Meetings turned into contests of persuasion, flattery, and insinuation, with Hitler as judge, jury, and audience. The atmosphere inside the party was less camaraderie than court politics, a realm where survival depended on suspicion as much as service. Stormtroopers, SS men, and police officers mirrored their leaders' rivalries in the streets, deepening divisions at every level. Loyalty became currency, traded and tested daily. The Nazi Party, though outwardly monolithic, was inside a house of knives. Hitler thrived on this tension, for it made him indispensable, but he also knew it was a fire that could consume him if unchecked. The SA's millions gave Röhm dangerous leverage, while the Reichswehr's warnings gave the generals a veto on future war. Himmler's SS offered discipline and personal loyalty, while Göring's power base in Prussia made him a kingmaker. Goebbels ensured that Hitler alone appeared as the movement's unifying symbol, the sun around which all factions orbited. But beneath the surface, resentment sharpened and each man plotted to secure his place in the coming order. Hitler's genius was to delay decision, to balance rivals long enough to extract loyalty from each, while never fully committing. Yet history does not allow indefinite postponement, and by mid-1934 the contradictions were too sharp to sustain. Röhm demanded action, the generals demanded restraint, and Hitler's rivals demanded resolution. The tension within the Nazi Party was reaching its breaking point, and soon it would erupt in violence that would decide who ruled and who would be destroyed. By the spring of 1934, the old Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, President of Germany, was in failing health, his once commanding presence reduced to a frail shadow. Living on his East Prussian estate at Neudeck, he spent more time in the company of doctors and attendants than ministers of state. His voice, once thunderous in the trenches of Tannenberg, now rasped with the weakness of age. At 86, he represented the last living link to the imperial era, the final guardian of a Germany that had died in 1918. Hitler revered him publicly, bowing in deference, but privately understood that Hindenburg's death would remove the last restraint on his power. Until then, the old president's authority remained a bulwark for conservatives, generals, and aristocrats who distrusted the Nazis. These men believed that only Hindenburg's prestige prevented Hitler from seizing total control outright. In salons and boardrooms, whispers turned into plans. What would become of Germany when the field marshal was gone? The urgency to act before that moment grew more intense with each passing week. For Hitler, time itself became the most dangerous adversary. The conservative establishment, though fractured in details, was united in its fear of the SA and Röhm's ambitions. Business leaders dreaded talk of a second revolution that threatened property, profits, and industrial order. Aristocrats clung to estates that had survived centuries, fearful that stormtroopers would trample them in the name of populist revolution. Generals saw in Röhm's legions a direct challenge to their prestige, their monopoly on command, and their vision of a professional army. In this climate, Hitler's allies of convenience turned into critics, demanding he rein in the force that had once carried him to power. They viewed the stormtroopers not as guarantors of order, but as a destabilizing mob whose excesses could topple the fragile state. Every rally, every march of millions, reinforced their unease that the regime might devour itself from within. These voices carried weight, for they controlled the livers of finance, the farms that fed cities, and the officer corps that commanded weapons. Hitler knew that if he ignored them, he risked losing the legitimacy he sought among Germany's traditional elite. Without their support, his dictatorship might stand on sand. Their pressure became as relentless as the drums of the SA themselves. Industrial magnates, who had financed Nazi campaigns, now demanded reassurances that their investments were safe. In smoky Berlin boardrooms, captains of steel and coal spoke of stability, contracts, and international confidence. They worried that Röhm's radical rhetoric would scare foreign investors and disrupt delicate negotiations for trade and loans. The memory of hyperinflation was fresh, and no industrialist wished to see another collapse driven by political adventurism. Hitler promised them protection, speaking of law, order, and discipline, even as his stormtroopers swaggered unchecked in the streets. Behind his polished speeches, though, lay calculations about how long he could appease both sides. Moneymen wanted calm, stormtroopers wanted revolution. The contradiction threatened to split his movement and alienate the very patrons who had elevated him to power. Hitler's genius was to nod in all directions, making each side believe he understood their fears. But in the end, a decision would be forced upon him by the very allies he depended on. In aristocratic salons and country estates, the Junker class of Prussia also made its position known. They valued hierarchy, tradition, and discipline, virtues they saw imperiled by Röhm's populist army. These men had commanded regiments for generations, and they recoiled at the idea of clerks and labourers donning brown shirts and calling themselves soldiers. They viewed the SA as a rabble, a force that degraded the very word army with its drunken violence and undisciplined marches. Letters circulated through the officer corps, echoing the same sentiment. The Reichswehr would not be replaced. Aristocrats pressed their influence upon Hindenburg, urging him to demand Hitler curb the stormtroopers. The field marshal, though weary, shared their view and signalled his displeasure at the SA's arrogance. To conservatives, the army represented Germany's soul, while Röhm's legions threatened to burn it down in the name of revolution. They did not yet call for blood, but their patience was nearly exhausted. The message to Hitler was unmistakable: act, or lose the establishment's loyalty. Within the officer corps, the warnings grew sharper, couched in the language of discipline and national security. Generals made it clear that without action against Röhm, they would withdraw cooperation from Hitler's government. They threatened to block rearmament programs, to withhold support for foreign policy, even to resign commissions en masse if necessary. These were not empty words. The army remained the sole professional instrument of defense, its loyalty essential for any future war. They knew that Hitler dreamed of conquest, but they reminded him that only their expertise could make it possible. The Reichswehr demanded guarantees that the SA would be subordinated or dismantled, and they pressed the demand through Hindenburg's office. The old president, frail but resolute, warned Hitler that unless the stormtrooper menace was resolved, emergency measures might be considered. For Hitler, such a rebuke carried terrifying weight, for Hindenburg still held the legal power to dismiss him. The general's ultimatum was therefore more than institutional, it was existential. Hitler could not risk a rupture with the only force capable of waging his future wars. Amid this pressure, Hitler walked a tightrope, balancing the competing demands of mass movement and elite acceptance. In public, he praised Röhm, spoke of unity, and urged patience, projecting loyalty to his old comrade. In private, he reassured generals and industrialists that their fears would be addressed, offering vague promises of discipline and restraint. He attended dinners with bankers, paraded with officers, and made speeches that emphasized order over revolution. He flattered aristocrats by invoking Prussian tradition, while still appearing to the SA as the architect of their revolutionary dream. Every word, every gesture was calculated to maintain loyalty from all sides, even as they contradicted one another. Yet behind the mask of balance, Hitler began to lean decisively toward the side that held the levers of power. He understood that Röhm's mass could intimidate, but the general's discipline could win wars. The stormtroopers were a ladder he had climbed, but the Reichswehr was the wall upon which his empire would be built. The calculus was cruel, but for Hitler survival was always pragmatic. Göring, Himmler, and Goebbels all exploited this moment, feeding Hitler intelligence, gossip, and propaganda that painted Röhm as a liability. Göring warned of conspiracies, suggesting that Röhm plotted to seize power for himself. Himmler offered the SS as a disciplined alternative, small but loyal, ready to do whatever Hitler commanded. Goebbels flooded the airwaves with stories of SA excesses, portraying them as reckless thugs endangering Germany's stability. Together they formed a chorus urging Hitler to choose necessity over sentiment. Businessmen and generals, aristocrats and ministers echoed the same refrain: the SA must be curbed or the regime would collapse under its weight. The pressure mounted from all sides, leaving Hitler no room to maneuver indefinitely. Even Röhm's loyalty became a double-edged sword, for his trust made him blind to the danger he faced. By June 1934, the circle around Hitler had narrowed, with knives quietly sharpened in the shadows. The conservative establishment had made its will known, and Hitler was preparing to obey. The pressure from conservative elites did not merely influence Hitler. It forced his hand, shaping the course of history. Hindenburg's declining health, the army's ultimatums, and the fears of businessmen combined into an irresistible demand. Hitler craved legitimacy not only in the eyes of the masses, but also in the gaze of generals, aristocrats, and industrialists who held Germany's true power. To secure that legitimacy, he would have to sacrifice Röhm and the stormtroopers who had carried him to the gates of power. It was a decision drenched in irony. The revolutionary movement that had destroyed the Republic would itself be destroyed for the sake of order. Hitler, ever the opportunist, prepared to turn on his own creation in order to secure the future he envisioned. The conservative elites, believing they had forced his compliance, were satisfied. For now, they could not know that in submitting the SA to destruction, they had also submitted themselves to Hitler's absolute rule. The storm they feared would be broken, but the tempest that replaced it would consume the world. Legitimacy had been purchased, and the price would soon be paid in blood. For Adolf Hitler, Ernst Röhm was not just another subordinate, but one of the few men he ever called friend. Their bond stretched back to the trenches of the First World War and the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, where Röhm had stood by Hitler during bullets, prison, and humiliation. Röhm was a comrade who had marched beside him when the Nazi Party was little more than a handful of dreamers in a Munich beer hall. He had been loyal when others doubted, steadfast when others fled, and in the early years, his SA had been the muscle that kept the movement alive. Hitler admired his blunt courage, the way he spoke without artifice, unafraid to offend allies or enemies alike. In Röhm he saw not a polished politician, but a soldier, hardened and scarred, who embodied the rough honesty of the trenches. They addressed each other with familiarity, ate together, and exchanged confidences in ways Hitler rarely allowed with others. This intimacy gave Röhm a special place in Hitler's world, one that even Göring, Himmler, and Goebbels envied. But in politics, friendship is often the most dangerous tie of all, and by 1934, that tie was pulling Hitler in two irreconcilable directions. Röhm's vision was radical, and it clashed fatally with the course Hitler had chosen for his regime. He believed the national revolution of 1933 was incomplete, a half-finished storm that needed to sweep away not just communists but also conservatives, aristocrats, and industrial elites. Röhm spoke openly, of dissolving the Reichswehr and replacing it with his millions of stormtroopers, creating a people's army drawn from the ranks of the common man. In taverns and training grounds, he promised his followers that their loyalty would be rewarded not with parades, but with power. His rhetoric frightened those who saw the regime's future in alliances with generals, bankers, and foreign investors. To Hitler, who dreamed of rearmament and war, Röhm's revolution threatened to alienate the very forces he needed most. The generals would never accept being replaced by stormtroopers, and the industrialists would never fund a second revolution. Yet Hitler could not dismiss Röhm's demands outright, for his SA was vast, fanatically loyal, and convinced that history belonged to them. It was a clash between revolutionary zeal and political survival, between the dream of comrades and the reality of power. And Hitler knew that the clock was ticking toward a reckoning. Warnings came thick and fast, whispered into Hitler's ear by men who saw Röhm as both rival and threat. Himmler, ever calculating, presented the SS as a disciplined alternative, loyal only to Hitler and untouched by revolutionary excess. Reinhard Heydrich, his brilliant and ruthless deputy, fed Hitler dossiers compiled by spies filled with claims of SA plots and conspiracies against the Fuhrer. Göring, flamboyant and ambitious, painted Röhm as reckless, a man who could topple the regime with drunken arrogance or deliberate treachery. Each of these men had their own interests, their own reasons to weaken Röhm, but their warnings resonated with Hitler's growing doubts. Reports of stormtroopers boasting that the revolution is not over reached Hitler's ears, feeding his paranoia. He began to question whether Röhm's friendship blinded him to betrayal, whether loyalty had become a mask for ambition. The circle around him tightened, sharpening suspicion into conviction. In the echo chamber of rivals, Röhm was no longer comrade but liability, and once Hitler began to doubt, the bond of years could unravel in days. Hitler's paranoia was stoked, not just by whispers, but by the visible arrogance of the stormtroopers themselves. Across Germany, SA men acted as if they owned the streets, barging into offices, harassing soldiers, and intimidating officials. Reports described stormtroopers in rural towns acting like feudal lords, drinking heavily, and demanding obedience from police chiefs and mayors. Officers of the Reichswehr complained of insults hurled by SA men, who called them toy soldiers and bragged that their days were numbered. Hitler, obsessed with image, worried that such excesses made his regime look chaotic and undisciplined in the eyes of allies and enemies alike. He knew foreign diplomats watched closely, reporting back to capitals in London, Paris, and Washington on the state of Germany. Every drunken brawl, every beating in the streets, was a blow to the legitimacy he craved on the world stage. The stormtroopers' behavior reinforced the general's warnings and magnified elite fears. Röhm's men were supposed to symbolize strength. Instead, they exposed weakness. And for a leader who thrived on appearances, this was intolerable. Yet Hitler hesitated, torn between sentiment and survival, between loyalty to Röhm and the demands of power. He remembered the days of 1923, when Röhm had marched with him toward the Bürgerbräukeller, ready to gamble life for revolution. He thought of prison conversations, of camaraderie in failure, of bonds forged in the shadow of defeat. Röhm had been there when few others were, and Hitler valued loyalty above all virtues. To betray Röhm felt like betraying his own past, cutting away part of his own story. Yet every conversation with generals, every letter from industrialists, every whisper from Himmler and Göring reminded him that his future could not coexist with Röhm's vision. He tried to delay, offering vague reassurances to both sides, speaking of unity while making no commitments. But indecision itself became dangerous, for it made him look weak to generals and uncertain to ministers. The storm could not be postponed forever, and Hitler knew that when the decision came, it would be final. The warnings from Himmler and Heydrich grew darker, their dossiers increasingly filled with claims of treason. They alleged that Röhm plotted to overthrow Hitler, to seize power with his stormtroopers, while the Fuhrer was weakened by opposition. Some of these reports were fabrications, exaggerations designed to fan Hitler's paranoia, but they landed with deadly effect. Göring added his own embellishments, suggesting that Röhm's ambition had become personal, that he no longer sought revolution for Germany but power for himself. Hitler's suspicion deepened, reinforced by his own fear of betrayal, a fear that had haunted him since the days of defeat in 1918. He saw enemies everywhere, conspiracies lurking in shadows, treachery disguised as friendship. Röhm's closeness, once comfort, now became unsettling. The very intimacy they shared made betrayal seem more plausible. In private, Hitler's temper flared at the thought of disloyalty, his paranoia fed by every whisper, every rumor. By June 1934, the question was no longer whether Röhm was dangerous, but how dangerous and what must be done. The seed of action had been planted, watered by fear and suspicion. Hitler's dilemma was sharpened by his own need for legitimacy, for without the army and elites, his rule would remain precarious. The Reichstag demanded action, and Hindenburg's fading health added urgency to their ultimatum. Business leaders threatened to withdraw support, while aristocrats whispered of restoring order by force if Hitler failed to act. Every delay risked the fragile coalition he had built, the network of generals, magnates, and politicians who still doubted him. Röhm, meanwhile, remained convinced of his friendship with Hitler, certain that no matter the whispers, his comrade would stand by him. He underestimated the cold pragmatism of the Fuhrer, who weighed friendship not in sentiment but in survival. Hitler found himself caught in a vise, pressed by allies who demanded Röhm's downfall and restrained by memories of loyalty. The contradiction ate at him, producing sleepless nights and bursts of temper, but the path narrowed with each passing day. Sentiment gave way to calculation, and calculation pointed toward blood. The bond of comradeship had become the fault line of dictatorship. By June of 1934, Hitler's suspicion hardened into resolve, though the final decision was still cloaked in secrecy. Röhm remained loyal, blind to the storm gathering around him, still addressing Hitler with intimacy and trust. In his mind, the Second Revolution was destiny, and Hitler's hesitation was merely tactical delay. But in Hitler's mind, loyalty was outweighed by necessity, and necessity demanded sacrifice. Himmler sharpened the knives, Heydrich compiled the lists, Göring prepared the police, and Goebbels crafted the narrative. Each rival tightened the circle, making Röhm's downfall not only possible but inevitable. Hitler's dilemma was ending, and his choice was made, not for friendship, not for sentiment, but for survival and absolute power. The man who had once shared his defeats would now be marked for destruction. Friendship had given Röhm access, suspicion had sealed his fate, the reckoning was coming, and it would be swift, ruthless, and bloody. June of 1934 was a month of whispers, dossiers, and private meetings that would decide the fate of millions. Behind the grandeur of Berlin's ministries and the marble halls of government, Hitler's lieutenants gathered to present him with evidence, some real, much fabricated, of Röhm's alleged treachery. Brain-hard Heydrich delivered reports claiming the SA was plotting a coup, complete with coded messages, secret stockpiles, and whispered oaths. Himmler assured Hitler that the SS had infiltrated Röhm's circles, uncovering proof that stormtroopers were preparing to march on Berlin. Göring, ever the showman, dramatized the threat, warning of blood in the streets unless decisive action was taken. Each dossier reinforced the same image. Röhm not as comrade, but as rival poised to strike. Whether the evidence was genuine mattered little. Perception was everything, and Hitler's paranoia transformed rumor into certainty. He paced rooms at the Reich Chancellery, muttering about betrayal, gripping the edges of tables with white-knuckled fury. The storm he had ridden to power now appeared ready to engulf him, and in Hitler's mind, the choice narrowed to survival through destruction. The meetings were tense, filled with the heavy air of inevitability and the urgency of action. In one session at the Reich Chancellery, generals presented their final ultimatum: either Röhm's power was curbed, or the Reichswehr would withdraw support. Hindenburg's emissaries, speaking with the weight of the dying president's authority, reminded Hitler that his legitimacy rested on the army's acceptance. Hitler listened, silent, his eyes flicking between ministers and officers, his mind calculating costs and outcomes. Röhm, loyal yet reckless, had millions of stormtroopers at his command, men who might resist if their leader were attacked, but the Reichswehr had discipline, weapons, and tradition, and without them, Hitler's dreams of rearmament and conquest would vanish. Himmler urged swiftness, warning that hesitation would embolden Röhm to strike first. Heydrich promised precise intelligence, lists of names, addresses, and schedules of the SA leadership. Göring offered the resources of Prussian police, ready to storm homes, seize weapons, and lock down cities. Each voice pushed Hitler toward the same conclusion, each word another nail in Röhm's coffin. The evidence against Röhm was built on layers of truth, distortion, and fabrication, woven together into a narrative too damning to ignore. Yes, Röhm had spoken of a second revolution, of replacing the Reichswehr with stormtroopers, of redistributing power among the common man. But the claims that he plotted a coup, that his men were ready to seize ministries and march on Berlin, were largely inventions of Himmler and Heydrich's intelligence machine. Reports described meetings that never happened, conspiracies that existed only on paper, and communications twisted to suggest treachery. Yet in Hitler's paranoid mind, exaggerations became certainties and uncertainties became proof. Every boast from a stormtrooper in a tavern, every rumor whispered by rivals, was catalogued and presented as evidence of a coming insurrection. Röhm's defiance, his refusal to tone down rhetoric, his dismissal of elite threats, only deepened suspicion. To Hitler, indecision was weakness, and weakness invited disaster. By mid-June, the narrative of conspiracy had become unassailable truth in his mind. The only question left was not whether to act, but when. Planning the purge required secrecy, precision, and the complicity of Hitler's most ruthless lieutenants. Himmler and Heydrich took the lead in intelligence, preparing lists of targets that extended far beyond Röhm's inner circle. Göring coordinated police units in Prussia, ensuring communications, weapons, and transportation would be ready for sudden strikes. The SS, still smaller than the SA, was chosen for its loyalty and discipline, its men briefed in hushed tones about missions cloaked in state security. Hitler himself reviewed the plans, his face calm, but his words laced with venom, demanding that the operation appear not as betrayal, but as justice. Vehicles were arranged, secret orders drafted, and loyal officers placed in key garrisons to prevent SA resistance. Each step was rehearsed with the precision of a military campaign, for the stakes were nothing less than Hitler's survival. Goebbels prepared propaganda lines to explain the purge, framing it as the defense of Germany against treason and chaos. Every man in the circle understood the danger, for if Röhm's stormtroopers resisted in force, civil war might ignite. But hesitation was gone. Hitler had chosen blood over loyalty. The machinery of murder was set in motion. The timing of the strike was debated fiercely. Each option weighed for risk and advantage. Himmler argued for immediate action, warning that delay would give Röhm time to rally his forces. Göring suggested waiting for Röhm to gather his commanders so they could be seized in one decisive blow. Heydrich proposed luring the SA leadership to a single location under false pretenses, making their destruction swift and surgical. Hitler vacillated, torn between the desire for certainty and the fear of hesitation, his paranoia feeding both caution and rage. Ultimately, the decision was made to act at the end of June, when Röhm planned to meet his officers at a spa in Bad Wiessee. There, away from Berlin, surrounded by loyalists yet isolated from mass reinforcements, Röhm would be vulnerable. The plan combined deception with brutality, offering no chance for negotiation once the trap was sprung. Hitler insisted he himself would confront Röhm, still clinging to the illusion of friendship, even as he prepared to destroy him. The decision carried the weight of finality. Once set in motion, there would be no turning back. In the days leading to the operation, Hitler's demeanor shifted, alternating between icy calm and explosive fury. He berated ministers, raged at rumors, and then fell into eerie silences that unsettled those around him. His aides described him as sleepless, pacing late into the night, muttering about betrayal and destiny. He demanded loyalty, oaths, scrutinized reports, and snapped at anyone who hesitated. At meals, his conversations swung from affectionate stories of Röhm to bitter tirades about treachery. It was as if Hitler was rehearsing in his own mind, justifying the act before it was done, convincing himself that necessity was greater than sentiment. His paranoia fused with calculation, producing a cold resolve that masked itself as righteous fury. To his inner circle, the transformation was unmistakable. The Fuhrer had decided, and nothing would dissuade him. The final days of June became a countdown, each hour thick with anticipation and dread. The stormtroopers marched as always, unaware that their fate was already sealed. The SS prepared in silence, their men sworn to secrecy, their orders clear and merciless. Trucks were fueled, weapons checked, and lists distributed to commanders who knew the exact homes, offices, and retreats to strike. In Berlin, Göring positioned police units to secure communications and prevent SA counterattacks. Himmler placed trusted men in prisons to receive the first wave of captives, while Heydrich rehearsed the arrests with his officers like a grim stage play. The Reichswehr was quietly informed, reassured that the coming action would restore their primacy and end the SA's menace. Generals, relieved, pledged their cooperation, signaling that they would not interfere. Every piece of the puzzle was fitted into place with ruthless efficiency, every contingency considered. The secrecy was so complete that even Röhm himself, still loyal, still trusting, remained oblivious. He spent his last days before the Purge speaking confidently of the revolution still to come. His trust in Hitler was absolute, and that trust would destroy him. On the eve of the operation, Hitler gathered his inner circle and delivered the words that transformed suspicion into execution. Röhm and his lieutenants would be eliminated, the SA leadership shattered, and the stormtroopers broken forever. He spoke of betrayal, of treason, of the need to protect Germany from chaos, wrapping the decision in the language of destiny. To those present, it was clear the order had been given, and history was about to turn on a night of blood. Goebbels prepared the narrative to deliver to the nation a story of conspirators thwarted and unity preserved. Himmler, Heydrich, and Göring moved their pieces into place, each eager to prove indispensable in the coming storm. Hitler himself prepared to confront Röhm one final time, a friend turned foe in the theatre of power. The plan was ruthless in scope, but precise in detail, leaving no room for escape. The night of long knives had not yet fallen, but its shadow stretched across Germany, and as June ended, the silence before the storm grew unbearable. Dawn on June 30th, 1934, broke heavy and humid over Germany, but in Berlin the air was already charged with urgency. Hitler had received word that Röhm and his lieutenants were gathering at a spa in WW2, unaware that their hours of freedom were dwindling. Reports, real and fabricated, spoke of stormtrooper unrest, of leaders demanding the completion of the Second Revolution. For Hitler, hesitation had ended. This was the day he would act, the day comradeship would give way to blood. He ordered his plane readied at Tempelhof, his entourage assembled, his SS guards equipped with pistols and carbines. As engines roared to life, his aides noted his grim silence, a man consumed by paranoia, yet cloaked in icy resolve. The flight south was not just a journey of distance, but a descent into betrayal, a final crossing of the line between loyalty and necessity. At each stop along the way, telephone lines buzzed with coded messages, setting the machinery of arrests into motion across the Reich. Hitler was no longer delaying or persuading. He was hunting, and his prey was the friend who once shared his defeat. The decision to confront Röhm in person was calculated, a blend of loyalty, theater, and intimidation. Hitler wanted to see his old comrade face to face, to strip him of power not through whispers but through personal humiliation. WW2, nestled in the Bavarian Alps near a tranquil lake, was meant to be a retreat for Röhm and his stormtrooper commanders. They lounged in uniforms half-buttoned, drinks in hand, convinced of their leader's protection and Hitler's enduring trust. The setting was deceptively peaceful, alpine air, the sound of water lapping against the shore, and men boasting of revolutions yet to come. Hitler's convoy cut through the quiet landscape, black cars and SS guards breaking the stillness of the Bavarian morning. Villagers stared in silence as motorcades roared past, unaware that history was hurtling toward violence. Hitler, sitting stiff in his seat, rehearsed the words he would unleash upon Röhm, a blend of rage and betrayal. His hand gripped the pistol at his side, though it was not yet clear whether he would fire it himself. The mountain spa was about to become the stage of a reckoning. When Hitler's entourage arrived at WW2, the SA leaders were unprepared, still half asleep from nights of drink and boasting. Stormtrooper guards stood listlessly by, assuming the Fuhrer's arrival was a gesture of camaraderie, not catastrophe. Hitler burst into the hotel with sudden ferocity, his black-coated SS men fanning out to seize the building. He stormed up the stairs, throwing open doors with violent force, shouting accusations of betrayal and treason. Röhm's deputies, startled and disheveled, were dragged from their rooms, their protest drowned by boots and barked orders. Some were still in bedclothes, others clutched half-packed suitcases, none believing until the last moment that this was real. Hitler himself confronted Röhm, standing over the man who had once been his closest ally. Röhm, heavy-set and defiant, looked up with surprise, but not fear, certain that Hitler would not betray him. But Hitler's words were sharp, accusing Röhm of conspiracy, of plotting against the state, of turning the SA into a weapon for treachery. In that moment, friendship was replaced by fury, and the decision was made. Röhm was seized, stripped of his authority, and placed under arrest by Hitler's personal command. Unlike his deputies, who were manhandled and beaten, Röhm was treated with a measure of restraint, a grim acknowledgement of their shared past. He was led out of the hotel, surrounded by SS men, his hands trembling but his voice still steady. The spa that had been a retreat for comradeship was now surrounded by rifles, black uniforms, and the cold machinery of betrayal. Outside, stormtroopers looked on in disbelief, unable to comprehend that their leader was being dragged away by the man they worshipped as Fuhrer. Some wept, others shouted, but none resisted. The presence of Hitler himself disarmed their will. Vehicles waited to transport Röhm and his deputies to Munich, where their fates would be decided. Hitler barked orders, demanding swiftness, his eyes blazing with the fire of paranoia and triumph. The arrest was not just an act of necessity, it was a performance for history, a display of Hitler's authority, and in that display the purge had officially begun. As Röhm was taken away, other SA leaders across Germany were simultaneously being seized in coordinated raids. In Berlin, Göring unleashed police units and Gestapo squads, storming apartments, smashing doors, and dragging men into waiting cars. Himmler and Heydrich's SS men executed their lists with brutal efficiency, striking in Munich, Dresden, and Hamburg. Some arrests turned into executions on the spot, as stormtroopers resisted or shouted defiance at their captors. Guns cracked in alleyways, bodies fell in stairwells, and the streets that had once belonged to the SA now echoed with their cries. Many were caught unprepared, convinced until the last moment that Hitler's loyalty to Röhm guaranteed their safety. Instead, their trust became their downfall, their disbelief turning into panic as friends vanished in the night. The purge spread like wildfire, sweeping up not only stormtroopers, but political opponents, dissidents, and even former allies deemed unreliable. Hitler's command had unleashed a machine that would not stop until its lists were complete. And at its center stood the arrest of Röhm, the symbol of the storm shattered by the Fuhrer himself. Röhm's transfer to Munich was marked by silence, the silence of men who knew their fate, but clung to disbelief. He was placed in Stadelheim prison, a grim fortress of stone and iron where political prisoners had languished before him. Guards eyed him nervously, aware of his reputation, but obeyed orders to treat him with cold formality. In his cell, Röhm brooded, convinced that Hitler would yet reconsider, that friendship would outweigh politics. His stormtroopers were loyal, his cause righteous, surely the Fuhrer would remember their shared history. Yet outside those walls, Hitler's lieutenants debated how long Röhm would be allowed to live. Some argued for immediate execution, fearing his survival might rally resistance. Others urged Hitler to act personally, to show Germany that no one, not even Röhm, was above his authority. Röhm's hours in prison were not filled with fear, but with a misplaced faith in loyalty. That faith would soon be shattered by a pistol in a cell. The arrest at Bad WW2 reverberated across Germany like the crack of thunder. Newspapers rushed out editions proclaiming the betrayal of Röhm, the conspiracy of the SA, the Führer's courage in saving the nation. Goebbels orchestrated the message, portraying Hitler as the vigilant leader who had acted decisively to crush treason. Radio broadcasts echoed the same story, turning confusion into clarity, doubt into faith. For the German public, already conditioned by propaganda and fear, the arrest became proof of Hitler's strength. Few questioned the narrative, fewer still dared to speak if they did. In towns and cities, stormtroopers lowered their heads, uncertain whether to mourn or obey. Some clung to loyalty, others melted into silence, all stunned by the swiftness of the purge. The regime had turned on its own with terrifying efficiency, and no one could doubt who held ultimate power. Hitler had crossed the Rubicon, and Germany followed. June 30th, 1934, marked not only the arrest of Röhm, but the beginning of a bloodletting that would reshape the Nazi movement forever. The purge spread from spas and hotels to homes and prisons, sweeping away not only stormtroopers, but political rivals of every kind. Hitler had struck with ferocity, proving that friendship, loyalty, and history meant nothing beside the demands of power. Röhm's downfall symbolized the fate of all who placed trust in bonds stronger than obedience to the Fuhrer. The night of the long knives had begun, and Germany would never again be the same. In the stillness of that morning, among the mountains of Bavaria, one man's arrest became the turning point of a regime. The stormtroopers had been broken, the generals reassured, the elites satisfied, and the Führer's supremacy confirmed. Blood had replaced ballots, terror had replaced trust, and dictatorship had replaced uncertainty. The Reich had been reforged in violence, and its future would be written in fear. And it began with the man who once called Hitler his friend. The morning of June 30th, 1934, did not end with Röhm's arrest. It expanded into a storm of violence that swept across Germany. Hitler's lieutenants, armed with prepared lists, unleashed the SS, Gestapo, and loyal police units to strike at the heart of the SA. Hotels, apartments, and barracks were raided with brutal efficiency, doors smashed open by rifle butts, and pistols pressed against startled faces. Brownshirt commanders, who had swaggered in parades, now stood in nightshirts, blinking under the glare of flashlights. Some protested loyalty to Hitler, insisting they had done nothing but serve, only to be dragged into waiting cars regardless. Others attempted to flee, only to be gunned down in alleys or seized at train stations. The arrests were not trials, they were abductions dressed in the authority of the state. As the first prisoners were loaded into trucks, the reality of betrayal finally dawned on the SA. What began as loyalty had turned overnight into a death sentence, and the purge had only just begun. In Munich, SS units stormed the homes of senior SA officers, executing many on the spot without hesitation. Edmund Heines, Röhm's deputy, was discovered in his hotel room with a young companion, dragged into the courtyard and shot by SS guards. Other deputies, men who had commanded thousands, were executed in basements, fields, or dungeons, their deaths swift and brutal. The executions carried a message. This was not justice by law, but vengeance by power, swift and merciless. Some begged for Hitler, calling his name as if he might appear and save them, not knowing he had signed their doom. In Berlin, Göring's police units carried out similar raids, storming SA offices, seizing documents, and arresting leaders. Trains filled with prisoners headed for Gestapo cells, where interrogations were conducted with fists and pistol barrels. In Dresden, Hamburg, and Stuttgart, local commanders found themselves cornered and shot, their bodies dumped in shallow graves. Every city felt the purge as fear spread faster than newsprint. The SA, once a giant, was decapitated in hours. The chaos of the purge spread beyond the SA into a broader settling of scores. Rival politicians, old enemies, and inconvenient figures suddenly found themselves on the lists, condemned alongside Röhm's men. General Kurt von Schleicher, the former Chancellor who had opposed Hitler, was executed in his home with his wife by his side. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the Bavarian politician who had betrayed Hitler during the failed beer hall putsch, was hacked to death by an SS squad. Gregor Strasser, a former Nazi rival who had split with Hitler in 1932, was dragged from his cell and shot in cold blood. These killings widened the purge from a political necessity into a purge of memory itself, erasing those who had humiliated Hitler in years past. To the public, it was explained as part of a grand conspiracy, a web of traitors whose threads reached into every corner of the Reich. In reality, it was opportunism disguised as justice, revenge clothed in legality. The purge devoured not just conspirators, but ghosts of old grudges. The knife cut wider than Röhm's circle. Across Germany, the atmosphere shifted into one of raw terror, where no one knew who might be next. Brownshirts who had once marched with pride now cowered in their homes, uncertain whether to wear their uniforms or burn them. Officers kept pistols on their nightstands, waiting for the midnight knock that might come from comrades turned executioners. Families wept at stations as husbands and sons were hauled away, often with no explanation but a vague charge of treason. Telephone lines buzzed with rumors, reports of shootings in Berlin, arrests in Munich, and executions in Hamburg. No one knew how wide the purge would spread, and in that uncertainty lay its power. Hitler's regime was demonstrating that safety came not from loyalty, but from submission. Even Nazis outside the SA felt the chill, as ministers wondered whether rivals might whisper their names into Hitler's ear. The message was clear: power was absolute, and mercy had no place in the new order. Fear itself became a weapon, sharper than any blade. The Gestapo and SS coordinated with ruthless precision, turning Germany into a patchwork of checkpoints, raids, and executions. Files had been prepared in advance, with names, addresses, and personal details collected by Heydrich's intelligence machine. Each raid unfolded like a grim stage play, rehearsed in silence, executed with brutal clarity. Cars screeched to a halt, boots thundered up stairwells, and shots echoed in courtyards before neighbors could react. Corpses were dragged into waiting trucks, covered with tarps, and whisked away before dawn. Prisons overflowed, forcing makeshift detention centers in schools, warehouses, and cellars. The SS relished its role, proving its discipline against the SA's chaos, its loyalty against the stormtroopers' arrogance. Every successful execution expanded Himmler's influence. Every arrest enhanced Heydrich's reputation for ruthless efficiency. Göring's police played their part too, eager to prove loyalty and secure their share of power. The purge was not just about killing, it was about hierarchy, proving who would dominate the machinery of terror. The executions themselves carried the brutality of spectacle, though few were witnessed by the public. In prison courtyards, men were lined up against walls, blindfolded, and shot by firing squads. In basements, pistols were pressed to temples, shots muffled by thick stone walls. Some were given moments to write final notes to families, though most never reached their destinations. The SS treated the process with chilling detachment, recording names, ticking boxes, and moving to the next target as if crossing items from a list. Guards joked, smoked cigarettes, and drank between shootings, numbing themselves to the human cost of their work. Bodies piled up faster than officials could account for them, and mass graves became the solution to efficiency. The violence was industrial in rhythm, personalized in cruelty, and devastating in scale. For those caught in the machine, death came swiftly, often without a final word. For those watching from outside, the silence of absence spoke louder than screams. The SA's leadership had been erased, not only from power, but from existence. Fear seeped into the highest ranks of the Nazi Party, where ministers and deputies whispered in corners, wondering who might be next. Goebbels, loyal to Hitler yet always insecure, clung to his propaganda machine, hoping obedience would shield him from suspicion. Goering, though secure in his role, moved carefully, aware that even allies could become targets if they overreached. Himmler, emboldened by the SS's role, maneuvered to expand his authority, but even he tread cautiously under Hitler's watchful eye. The purge had taught them all that Hitler's trust was conditional, shifting, and dangerous to rely upon. Loyalty was no longer protection, it was expectation, one that could never be questioned or tested. The higher the rank, the sharper the knife at one's back. Ministers who had once joked about rivals now sat in silence, afraid that humor might be twisted into treachery. Every man looked over his shoulder, scanning shadows for the next whisper of suspicion. The Nazi Party was united, not by trust, but by fear. By the first week of July 1934, the purge of the SA leadership was nearly complete. Its ranks decapitated, its revolution silenced. Röhm's deputies were dead, its commanders executed, its middle ranks cowed into obedience. Hitler had struck swiftly, ruthlessly, and with a precision that stunned both enemies and allies. The SA, once a giant of millions, had been reduced to a broken shell, its remnants folded back into the party without protest. In Berlin and Munich, survivors lowered their heads, grateful simply to be alive, stripped of ambition, and bound by terror. The message reverberated across Germany. The Fuhrer's power was absolute, his will unquestionable, his enemies doomed. Fear spread like wildfire, embedding itself not only in the Nazi Party, but in the nation itself. What began as the arrest of Röhm had become a blood purge that transformed the balance of power. The SA was broken, the SS had risen, and Hitler stood supreme among the factions he once juggled. The purge of the storm had forged the dictatorship in blood. The Night of the Long Knives was conceived as a blow against the SA, but almost immediately its blade cut far wider than Röhm's stormtroopers. Once unleashed, the purge became a tool for Hitler to erase not only immediate threats, but long-standing enemies who haunted his memory. Lists were amended in the shadows, names added with strokes of the pen by Himmler, Heydrich, and Göring. These were men who had never worn brown shirts, but who represented obstacles, grudges, or reminders of weakness. The pretext of Röhm's alleged conspiracy allowed their elimination to be framed as part of a single vast plot. Hitler's lieutenants understood this was their moment, their chance to settle rivalries and prove their loyalty by delivering heads. No court convened, no evidence was required. Suspicion alone carried the weight of a death sentence. The purge became elastic, stretching to encompass figures whose crimes were not treason but opposition. Blood now flowed in channels far beyond Röhm's circle, staining the very foundations of German politics. One of the most prominent victims was General Kurt von Schleicher, a former Chancellor of Germany and a soldier who had once maneuvered to block Hitler's path to power. Schleicher, a political schemer and veteran officer, had believed he could manipulate the Nazi movement into serving conservative ends. His arrogance in underestimating Hitler had made him a dangerous enemy in Hitler's eyes, a man too clever, too independent, and too proud. On June 30th, SS men arrived at his Berlin villa, breaking the quiet of the leafy suburb with the sound of boots and gunfire. Schleicher was shot in his own home, his wife killed beside him as she tried to intervene. Neighbors heard the shots, but none dared approach until the SS had departed, leaving the bodies sprawled on polished floors. The murder was framed as part of Röhm's conspiracy, though Schleicher had no part in SA intrigues. To Hitler, it was not about conspiracy but revenge, a settling of scores from the years of maneuvering that had threatened his rise. Schleicher's death demonstrated that even the highest offices of the Republic offered no shield against the Führer's wrath. Another name on the list was Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the Bavarian politician who had betrayed Hitler during the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. Kahr, as State Commissioner of Bavaria, had promised support for Hitler's coup, but abandoned him at the critical moment, ordering police to fire on the marchers in Munich. For more than a decade, Hitler carried the humiliation of that failure, seething at Kahr's betrayal. On June 30th, the SS finally delivered his vengeance. Kahr was abducted, beaten, and taken to a forest near Munich, where he was hacked to death with pickaxes, his body left mutilated in shallow earth. The brutality was not mere execution, but symbolic retribution, a punishment for treachery that had scarred Hitler's pride. For the SS men who carried it out, the act was a demonstration of loyalty, proof that they could erase Hitler's humiliations with blood. Karr's death echoed like a ghost from the past, a reminder that Hitler never forgot betrayal, no matter how many years had passed. The Purge was not only political cleansing, it was personal revenge, written in the language of violence. The scope of the killings expanded further into the ranks of the Nazi Party itself, where old rivals were eliminated under the cover of the Purge. Gregor Strasser, once a leading figure in the party's early years, had broken with Hitler in 1932 over ideological and strategic differences. Strasser's socialist leanings and independent following had posed a challenge to Hitler's supremacy, and though sidelined, he remained a potential rallying point for dissent. On June 30th, Strasser was dragged from his cell and executed, his death silencing not only a rival, but a faction within the party that might have grown in future years. Other lesser figures met similar fates, men who had quarreled with Goebbels, clashed with Himmler, or threatened Göring's ambitions. The Purge became a settling of scores within the Nazi hierarchy itself, a pruning of branches to leave only the trunk that fed directly into Hitler. Ambition, rivalry, and old grudges were erased in a single stroke of coordinated terror. The Nazi Party emerged not stronger in unity, but hollowed out of independence, reshaped into a monolith of fear. Göring and Himmler exploited the moment to target figures who stood in the way of their personal empires. Göring's police in Prussia struck at men who might resist his growing control over the economy and the emerging Luftwaffe. Himmler, with Heydrich at his side, used the Purge to expand the SS by demonstrating its efficiency as the regime's chosen instrument of terror. Lists were padded with local rivals, political dissidents, and outspoken critics whose deaths would go unnoticed in the chaos. In some towns, arrests bore no relation to Röhm at all. They were simply opportunities to silence troublesome voices once and for all. The result was a purge that felt both surgical and chaotic, precise in its planning, yet sprawling in its execution. Victims were swept up not for what they had done, but for what they symbolized: opposition, defiance, or memory. Each killing tightened the grip of Hitler's lieutenants, rewarding loyalty with power. The Purge had become a harvest of ambition, each rival's fall feeding another's rise. For the German public, the expansion of the Purge was both terrifying and confusing. Newspapers, controlled by Goebbels' propaganda ministry, announced the discovery of vast conspiracies linking Röhm, Schleicher, Strasser, and others in a web of treason. Radio broadcasts repeated the narrative of Hitler's decisive action to save Germany from civil war, portraying him as the guardian of unity and order. Yet behind closed doors, Germans whispered of neighbors who had vanished, of officials shot without trial, of prominent names struck down with alarming ease. The suddenness of the violence shattered any illusions of security, reminding all that power was absolute and arbitrary. Ordinary citizens who had once admired the stormtroopers now saw their corpses in the gutters, replaced by the black-clad SS who marched with grim precision. Fear silenced questions, and silence became complicity. The Purge was not just an act of violence, it was a lesson to a nation. No one was untouchable, and no one was safe. Within the Nazi Party, the lesson cut even deeper, for the Purge demonstrated that loyalty was never enough. Röhm had been a comrade, Schleicher a chancellor, Strasser a party brother, Kauffer a figure from the past. All were swept away by Hitler's will. Ministers and deputies now looked upon one another with suspicion, knowing that today's ally could be tomorrow's corpse. The violence created a new atmosphere of obedience, one forged not in faith but in terror. Goebbels seized the opportunity to proclaim Hitler as the savior who had crushed treason with his own hands. Himmler used the bloodshed to elevate the SS from a guard unit into a national force of fear. Goering presented himself as the indispensable enforcer who had protected Berlin. Each man secured his position by showing usefulness in the violence. The purge was not only about eliminating enemies, it was about consolidating the inner circle, and in that consolidation, Hitler emerged as untouchable. By the time the purge subsided in early July, the tally of the dead extended far beyond the SA. Estimates ranged into the hundreds, though the true number was likely higher, lost in the silence of mass graves and unreported executions. Old generals, rival politicians, forgotten enemies, and ambitious partymen all lay among the dead. The Reichstag, obedient and cowed, would later legalize the murders, declaring them acts of state necessity. Hitler presented himself as the man who had acted with courage to save Germany, his violence cloaked in the language of justice. But beneath the propaganda lay the truth. The purge had been both survival and revenge, necessity and indulgence. Blood had cleansed not just the SA, but Hitler's memory of betrayal, opposition, and rivalry. The stormtroopers had been shattered, the conservatives silenced, the rivals erased, and the lieutenants elevated. The Reich had been reforged in violence, and its dictator had proven that no limit bound his will. Germany's future would march not to debate or dissent, but to fear. In the aftermath of the raids, Ernst Röhm found himself confined within the grey walls of Stadelheim prison in Munich, a fortress of iron bars and cold stone. The man who once commanded millions now sat in a narrow cell, its damp walls sweating with summer heat, the air heavy with the stench of despair. Guards stood outside his door with rifles, avoiding his gaze, unsure whether to show respect or contempt for a fallen titan. Röhm remained defiant, convinced that Hitler would not abandon him after years of comradeship and loyalty. He paced the floor like a caged animal, his boots striking the stone with restless rhythm, muttering of revolution unfinished. For 3 days he was left in limbo, neither interrogated nor judged, only watched in silence by wardens who awaited orders from above. To his followers outside, rumors swirled that their leader still lived, a flicker of hope in the widening darkness. But within those prison walls, Röhm's fate was already sealed. His survival hung not on loyalty, but on Hitler's decision, and Hitler had already chosen necessity over friendship. On July 1st, 1934, emissaries from Hitler arrived at the prison bearing a grim message wrapped in the language of honor. 2 SS officers, carrying pistols and a sealed envelope, entered Röhm's cell under the pretense of delivering the Fuhrer's will. Inside the envelope was Hitler's offer: suicide, the so-called honorable exit, befitting a soldier and comrade who had erred. Röhm was given a pistol with a single bullet, the cold metal laid upon his bunk as if it were a gift rather than a sentence. The officers stood stiffly, their faces betraying neither sympathy nor malice, only the mechanical obedience of men carrying out orders. Röhm stared at the weapon, his heavy jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing as he read the words written in Hitler's hand. It was not mercy, but humiliation cloaked in ritual, a final chance to die by his own choosing rather than face execution. For a man of Röhm's pride, the offer was both insult and betrayal. The silence in the cell was broken only by his laughter, grim, bitter, and filled with scorn. Röhm's refusal was absolute, his defiance the final act of a man who would not bend, even in chains. He pushed the pistol away, demanding that Hitler himself come and finish what he had begun. His words cut with venom, declaring that if betrayal was to be sealed, it should be by the hand of the man he had called comrade. The SS officers shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to press the weapon back into his hands or carry out the next order. Röhm sat upon his cot, bare-chested, his scars from the Great War visible in the dim light, a soldier to the end. He spat at the idea of honor as defined by men who hid behind orders and uniforms, insisting that he would not grant Hitler the satisfaction of a quiet death. His defiance was not for witnesses or crowds, but for himself, a final rebellion against the machine he had once built. In rejecting suicide, he robbed Hitler of control over the manner of his death. It was a refusal as symbolic as it was fatal. Röhm had chosen not surrender, but confrontation, even if it was only with death itself. The officers left the cell to confer, their boots echoing down the corridor, leaving Röhm alone in the silence of his decision. In another room they consulted their orders, which were explicit. If Röhm refused the offer, he was to be executed without delay. Himmler and Heydrich had anticipated defiance, and Hitler had given his blessing for the matter to be resolved by force. The prison commandant was summoned, paperwork signed, and a small squad assembled to finish the task. Röhm's fate, once entangled with politics and intrigue, was now reduced to procedure. The execution would be swift, clinical, and without spectacle, hidden from the public eye. There would be no courtroom, no defense, no verdict, only the thud of boots and the crack of a pistol. For the SS, it was another duty, one among many, though even hardened guards felt the weight of killing a man so close to Hitler. Yet orders were orders, and orders carried the force of destiny. The machine of terror left no room for sentiment. Röhm's life was about to end within the same walls that had once confined petty criminals and thieves. When the SS returned to his cell, Röhm was still seated, his broad chest bare, his head held high. He did not flinch at the sight of pistols drawn, nor did he beg for mercy or attempt resistance. In that moment, the man who had once led millions of stormtroopers faced his killers with a calm born of defiance. One officer raised his weapon, hesitated for a heartbeat, then pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing off the stone walls, and Röhm slumped forward, his body collapsing onto the cot. A second shot followed to ensure finality, a brutal punctuation to the life of a man who had once imagined himself the master of Germany's revolution. Blood pooled on the cold floor, seeping into the cracks of stone that had seen countless prisoners before him. The silence afterward was suffocating, broken only by the scratching of a pen as the commandant recorded the death. Röhm's final act had been to deny Hitler the satisfaction of obedience. His death was not dignified, but it was defiant, and in defiance, he etched his final mark upon history. Outside the prison, news of Röhm's death spread quickly among Nazi leaders, though the public was told only what Goebbels wanted them to hear. The official statement framed his end as part of the treasonous plot uncovered by the Fuhrer, proof that Hitler had acted decisively to save the Reich. Newspapers declared that Röhm had confessed his guilt and chosen death with dignity, a fabrication designed to preserve the narrative of justice. In reality, his refusal and execution were known only to a handful of men, sealed away in silence. Among the SA, the knowledge of their leader's fate spread in whispers, silencing what little defiance remained. The stormtroopers had lost not just their commander, but their spirit. The purge was complete, and the revolution they dreamed of was over. Röhm's death was both symbolic and practical, the final severing of the bond between Hitler and the SA, and with his demise, the path was cleared for the SS to ascend in his place. For Hitler, Röhm's death carried both triumph and private torment. Though he revealed neither to his followers, in public he spoke of treason punished, of a leader betrayed by his own ambition, and of the necessity of ruthless action. In private, those closest to him recalled moments of brooding silence, as if the ghost of Röhm haunted the man who had ordered his death. Röhm had been more than an ally. He had been the comrade of old struggles, the man who shared defeat when others abandoned the cause. But in Hitler's world, sentiment was weakness, and weakness was fatal. The Purge had been about power, and power demanded sacrifice. Röhm had been the price of legitimacy, the offering made to generals, aristocrats, and industrialists who demanded order. Hitler swallowed whatever regret he felt, burying it beneath the mask of destiny. He presented himself as unshaken, even as he carried the weight of betrayal that could never be undone. For the dictator, survival had outweighed friendship, and survival had been purchased in blood. The execution of Ernst Röhm marked the definitive end of the SA's challenge and the triumph of Hitler's absolute authority. With his death, the stormtroopers were decapitated, their revolutionary zeal replaced by disciplined obedience to the Fuhrer. The SS rose in their place, their loyalty proven by the act of killing the man who had once stood at Hitler's side. The Reichstag, reassured, pledged its allegiance to Hitler, securing the military foundation for future conquests. Conservatives, industrialists, and aristocrats breathed easier, convinced that the threat of radical revolution had been buried with Röhm. Yet beneath the calm surface lay the reality of terror, for the Purge had shown that Hitler's will was bound by nothing, not friendship, not law, not history. Röhm's cell at Stadelheim became a silent monument to the cost of power, a reminder that even the closest ties could be severed by paranoia and ambition. His fate was the final chapter in the Purge, but the first chapter in a dictatorship that would rule by blood and fear. The man who had dreamed of a people's army died betrayed, and the man who betrayed him emerged as absolute master of Germany. When the smoke cleared from the night of the long knives, the once mighty SA had been reduced to a husk, its millions of men leaderless and broken. The stormtroopers who had swaggered through German streets in brown shirts now marched quietly, their heads lowered, stripped of political significance. Their barracks stood half empty, their rallies banned, their leaders executed or imprisoned. The sheer scale of the organization remained, but its spirit was extinguished, replaced by a culture of obedience rather than revolution. Those who survived clung to the illusion of loyalty, whispering that they still served Hitler even as their power dissolved into nothingness. The second revolution Röhm had promised lay dead in shallow graves across the Reich. The SA had become a shadow, tolerated as a training ground for young recruits, but never again trusted with authority. Its role was ceremonial, a tool for propaganda rather than power. In breaking the stormtroopers, Hitler had not only silenced dissent, but reshaped the very core of his movement. A new hierarchy was born, one forged in fear, loyalty, and blood. Into the void left by the SA stepped the SS, transformed almost overnight from a protective guard into a national elite force. Himmler and Heydrich capitalized on their moment, presenting the SS as the embodiment of discipline, loyalty, and ruthless efficiency. No longer a mere unit of bodyguards, the SS now commanded prisons, intelligence networks, and the machinery of terror. Its black uniforms, adorned with skull insignia and runic symbols, projected an aura of fear and mysticism. Membership was no longer open to the masses, but restricted to those who met strict racial and ideological criteria. Himmler spoke of the SS as a new aristocracy for Germany, an order of men bound not only by oaths but by bloodlines. The Purge had been their proving ground, their baptism in blood, and they emerged with prestige and power far beyond their size. Every execution carried out in June and July had been a step toward their ascension. Now, with Röhm dead and the SA shattered, the SS became the blade of Hitler's will. From this moment forward, they were no longer shadows at the edge of power, they were the instrument of it. The Reichswehr, too, found its position transformed by the Purge, its fears of stormtrooper dominance finally silenced. Generals who had threatened resignation now congratulated Hitler, relieved that the SA menace had been destroyed without a single shot fired in defense of their monopoly. Their prestige was preserved, their authority intact, and their alliance with Hitler cemented by necessity. Yet this alliance came at a price, for by endorsing the Purge, the army had tied itself irrevocably to the Nazi regime. In August 1934, with President Hindenburg on his deathbed, the generals agreed to swear an oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Hitler personally. Each officer raised his hand and pledged obedience unto death to the Fuhrer, binding the army to dictatorship with words as heavy as iron. The oath was more than ceremony, it was a moral surrender, a promise that erased any future claim of independence. From this moment forward, the Reichswehr became not an institution of state, but a tool of Hitler's personal will. The army had preserved itself, but in doing so, it had chained itself to the destiny of a single man. Hitler used the Purge as a lesson, a warning broadcast not only to his enemies, but to his allies. The message was unmistakable. No one, no matter their history, rank, or service, was beyond the reach of his wrath. Röhm had been a comrade, Schleicher a chancellor, Strasser a party brother, and Kahr a politician of influence. All had fallen without trial, executed at Hitler's command. Their corpses were reminders that power flowed only from the Fuhrer, and that survival depended on unquestioned obedience. Ministers, deputies, and generals alike whispered the same thought. If Röhm could be destroyed, so could anyone. The Purge had replaced loyalty with fear, a more durable bond in the machinery of dictatorship. Hitler stood before the Reichstag in July, justifying the killings as an act of state necessity, and the chamber applauded in unison. In that moment, murder had been legalized, violence sanctified, and dictatorship enshrined. The lesson was engraved not in speeches, but in blood, and Germany listened in silence. For the surviving stormtroopers, the transformation was swift and brutal. Once hailed as the vanguard of the Nazi revolution, they were reduced to drill units, parading for the public but forbidden any political role. Many veterans of the early movement felt betrayed, their sacrifices in street battles against communists and republicans erased overnight. Some quietly resigned, slipping back into civilian life, while others remained out of fear, clinging to the hope that service might protect them. Those who stayed found themselves under the watchful eye of the SS, every action scrutinized, every whisper of discontent reported. The SA became a ghost of its former self, a warning etched into uniforms still worn but devoid of meaning. Its men marched, but they no longer mattered. Röhm's vision of a people's army lay buried, and in its place rose a hierarchy that answered to one man alone. For the stormtroopers it was the ultimate betrayal. The revolution they had fought for had consumed them. The SS wasted no time in solidifying its dominance, expanding its control over police, prisons, and intelligence services. Heydrichsicherheitsdienst, the SD, became the all-seeing eye of the regime, gathering information on enemies real and imagined. Prisons overflowed with political detainees, guarded not by police but by SS men whose loyalty was absolute. Himmler oversaw the expansion of concentration camps, institutions that began as holding centers for opponents, but soon evolved into engines of fear and death. The SS positioned itself not just as an arm of enforcement, but as a state within the state, bound directly to Hitler. Its men swore oaths of loyalty, not to Germany or its institutions, but to the Fuhrer himself, mirroring the army's pledge. black-clad processions, torchlight ceremonies, and arcane rituals gave the SS an aura of sacred duty. Where the SA had been noisy and chaotic, the SS was silent and terrifying. Its power was invisible until it struck, precise and merciless. The Purge had given it legitimacy, and now it expanded without restraint. Conservatives who had once pressured Hitler to act against Röhm now congratulated themselves, believing they had tamed the dictator. Industrialists praised his decisiveness, aristocrats admired his restoration of order, and generals thanked him for preserving their monopoly. Yet in their relief lay their own defeat, for by endorsing the Purge, they had legitimized violence as a tool of state. The very act they applauded became the precedent for their own subjugation, though they did not yet see it. Hitler's power now rested on three pillars: the army's oath, the SS's loyalty, and the fear of elimination. Each reinforced the other, creating a system where dissent was not debated but destroyed. Conservative elites had gambled that Hitler would remain dependent on their influence. Instead, they had confirmed his supremacy, giving him the legitimacy he craved. They had demanded the destruction of Röhm, and in granting it, they had surrendered their own independence. Their applause was the sound of chains being clasped. By the end of 1934, Hitler stood as the unchallenged master of Germany, his authority forged in violence and consecrated by fear. The SA was reduced to insignificance, its millions broken into obedience and silence. The SS had risen as his loyal elite, an army within the army, devoted to his person and his ideology. The Reichswehr had sworn its oath directly to him, binding the nation's sword to his hand, and the Purge had demonstrated that dissent, whether from comrades, rivals, or former leaders, would be answered with death. The Night of the Long Knives was not merely a purge, it was a declaration of dictatorship, a bloody charter for a regime built on terror. Hitler's power was no longer theoretical, no longer contested, no longer fragile, it was absolute, and in that absoluteness lay the seeds of a catastrophe that would engulf not only Germany, but the world. When the gunfire ceased, and the bodies were buried in silence, Germany awoke to a new reality defined by fear, silence, and uneasy approval. In cities and villages alike, the Purge was spoken of only in whispers, carried from tavern to market stalls in half-finished sentences. Neighbors who had seen SS trucks pull away from homes avoided eye contact, fearful that curiosity itself might invite suspicion. Families of the executed received no explanations, no trials, only terse notices that their loved ones had died for treason. The suddenness of the violence shocked a nation accustomed to political maneuvering but unprepared for wholesale slaughter within the ruling movement. Yet alongside the fear, there was also relief among many Germans who had grown weary of stormtrooper arrogance and street brawls. To shopkeepers, small businessmen, and conservative professionals, the sight of the SA humiliated and crushed felt like the restoration of order. Hitler had struck with terrifying force, but in striking he also appeared to deliver peace. The silence that followed was not merely submission, it was acquiescence, and in that acquiescence, dictatorship rooted itself deeper. Goebbels wasted no time in framing the Purge as a heroic act of national salvation, flooding newspapers, radio, and newsreels with a single, unified narrative. The story was one of conspiracy thwarted, of treason cut short by the vigilance of the Fuhrer. Röhm and his men were painted as degenerates, power-hungry plotters who sought to drag Germany into civil war. Hitler, in contrast, was portrayed as the reluctant judge, a leader burdened by loyalty, but forced to act for the sake of the nation. Photographs showed him stern and resolute, the man who had dared to wield the knife against corruption within his own ranks. Editorials praised his courage, comparing him to a surgeon excising a cancer to save the body of Germany. The propaganda machine worked with ruthless efficiency, drowning out whispers of doubt with a tidal wave of orchestrated admiration. Even those who privately questioned the scale of the violence found themselves echoing the official line in public. The Purge was no longer a massacre, it was a myth of salvation, and myths once born have a power of their own. The Reichstag was summoned in July to sanctify the killings, transforming murder into law with a single vote. Hitler stood before the assembly, his voice heavy with the weight of destiny, declaring that he alone had assumed responsibility for Germany's survival. He admitted openly that men had been killed without trial, but argued that when the Reich was endangered, the Fuhrer himself became the highest judge. Deputies, cowed by fear and intoxicated by propaganda, rose in applause, granting unanimous approval to a law retroactively legalizing the executions. In that moment, legality itself was broken and remade, subordinated not to statutes or constitutions but to Hitler's will. The Reichstag had surrendered its authority, the courts had been bypassed, and the principle of law was replaced by the principle of Führer power. To many observers, the transformation was stunning in its simplicity. Germany had entered a new age where the word of one man was supreme. The Purge was no longer simply a political event, it had become the foundation stone of dictatorship, and with the applause of deputies, it was written into history as justice. Among the German people, reactions were as varied as their circumstances, but fear ensured that only one voice was ever heard aloud. In working-class neighborhoods, families who had admired Röhm's promises of revolution mourned quietly, avoiding any open expression of dissent. In rural towns, stormtroopers who had once swaggered now walked with subdued steps, their uniforms suddenly dangerous to wear. Middle-class Germans, weary of political violence, expressed relief that Hitler had acted decisively, welcoming the end of SA brawls that disrupted daily life. The churches, cautious and divided, offered little more than silence, unwilling to confront the regime so soon after its bloodletting. Intellectuals and academics, some horrified, some opportunistic, adjusted their lectures and writings to align with the new orthodoxy. Fear silenced protest, but relief softened outrage, creating an atmosphere where obedience felt both safe and rational. The Purge had terrified the nation into silence, but it had also won Hitler approval as a bringer of order. In the delicate balance between fear and relief, dictatorship found fertile ground. Foreign reactions were mixed, reflecting both unease and pragmatic acceptance of Hitler's consolidation of power. In Paris and London, diplomats expressed shock at the scale of the killings, though official statements were muted by fear of provoking confrontation. The French press denounced the Purge as barbaric, a return to medieval justice cloaked in modern uniform. The British, cautious and calculating, noted with alarm the destruction of the SA but took comfort in the apparent ascendancy of the army, which they hoped might restrain Hitler. In Rome, Mussolini approved, praising Hitler's decisiveness and comparing it to his own violent consolidation of power a decade earlier. Across the Atlantic, American newspapers reported the killings with sensational headlines, but the Roosevelt administration remained cautious, unwilling to sever ties. To foreign governments, the Purge revealed both Hitler's brutality and his control, a combination that demanded respect as much as fear. Few dared to predict what this concentration of power would mean for Europe's future. Fewer still recognized that it marked the birth of an unrestrained dictatorship. Within the Nazi Party itself, the Purge was received with a mixture of relief, terror, and ruthless calculation. Himmler's SS swelled with recruits, its prestige elevated by its role as the instrument of Hitler's will. Göring, triumphant, basked in his position as the enforcer of the Purge, parading his loyalty and efficiency before the Fuhrer. Goebbels tightened his grip on the nation's perception, spinning narratives that made heroes of the killers and villains of the dead. Ministers who had once hesitated now bent lower, their loyalty measured by the fervor of their public praise. The inner circle of the regime had been purified not of dissent but of independence, leaving only sycophancy and fear. Each man recognized that survival depended on usefulness, not friendship, for Röhm's fate had taught them all that even the closest ties could be severed. The party was now bound together not by ideology alone, but by complicity in murder. And in that complicity lay the cement of tyranny. For Hitler personally, the aftermath was a moment of triumph, a vindication of his instincts and his ruthlessness. He had gambled everything on the purge, risking civil war if the SA resisted, risking collapse if the army wavered. Instead, he emerged stronger than ever, his enemies destroyed, his rivals cowed, his allies bound by fear and gratitude. In speeches, he presented himself as the savior of Germany, the man who had prevented chaos by decisive action. To the masses, he was no longer merely a politician or a revolutionary. He was the embodiment of the nation's order, justice, and destiny. The myth of the Fuhrer grew in the shadow of the corpses he had ordered, transforming him from party leader into untouchable ruler. No German institution could challenge him now. No rival could stand against him. The purge had not weakened Hitler, it had crowned him. And from that crown radiated a power that would soon extend beyond Germany's borders. By July 1934, Hitler's authority in Germany was unchallenged, secured not by law or consensus, but by blood and fear. The SA was broken, the SS ascendant, the army bound by oath, and the conservative elites silenced by their own complicity. The German people, numbed by terror and soothed by propaganda, accepted the transformation as both inevitable and necessary. Foreign governments watched with unease, but their caution only emboldened Hitler's confidence. The night of the long knives had begun as a purge of a rival faction, but ended as the founding act of a dictatorship. From this moment onward, Hitler was not merely Chancellor, not merely party leader, but supreme ruler, wielding life and death without restraint. The silence in Germany was deafening, the silence of a people who understood that dissent had become fatal. In that silence, dictatorship thrived, its roots spreading deep into every corner of the Reich. The purge had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. For Germany there would be no turning back. In the summer of 1934, while Germany reeled from the shock of the purge, an old man lay dying on his East Prussian estate, the last vestige of the old order. President Paul von Hindenburg, Field Marshal of Tannenberg, and symbol of imperial glory, was 86 years old and fading fast. His lungs were weak, his memory faltered, and he spent his final days gazing out over the forests of Neudeck, surrounded by doctors and loyal attendants. The conservatives and generals who had once leaned upon his authority as a counterbalance to Hitler now prayed for his survival, knowing his death would unleash forces they could no longer control. Hindenburg, weary of politics, had withdrawn into silence, but his presence remained a check upon Hitler's ambition. The old soldier represented continuity with the past, the last thread tying the fragile republic to the traditions of the Kaiserreich. In the minds of millions, Hindenburg was still Germany's patriarch, a figure too sacred to be replaced by party banners. But on August 2nd, 1934, the inevitable came. The Field Marshal breathed his last, and with him died the final restraint upon Adolf Hitler. Hindenburg's death created an immediate constitutional crisis, for Germany's laws required the election of a new president. Yet Hitler, armed with the momentum of the Purge and the loyalty of the army, had no intention of submitting to democratic forms. Within hours of Hindenburg's passing, his cabinet announced that the offices of President and Chancellor would be merged into one. The title of Reichspräsident vanished, and in its place arose a new title, Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Chancellor of the Reich. No referendum preceded the decision. No debate was permitted. The announcement was presented as fait accompli, justified by the necessity of uniting authority in one strong hand. Newspapers printed glowing obituaries for Hindenburg, while simultaneously hailing Hitler as his natural successor. The symbolism was stark. The father of Germany had passed, and the son of destiny had inherited his mantle. What had once been a republic, however fragile, now became a personal dictatorship without precedent in German history. The Führer state had been born. The army, which had pressured Hitler to destroy Röhm, now delivered the final gift that secured his dictatorship. In a solemn ceremony, the Reichswehr swore a new oath of allegiance, not to the constitution, not to the state, not even to Germany itself, but to Adolf Hitler personally. Officers raised their right hands and pledged obedience unto death to the Führer, binding their honor not to law, but to the will of a single man. The oath was deliberate, crafted to erase any future claim of independence or resistance from the officer corps. For the generals, it was a pragmatic concession. Hitler had preserved their status by eliminating the SA, and now they would serve him in return. Yet in that moment of submission, they surrendered not only autonomy, but morality, chaining themselves to the fate of the dictator. From cadets in military academies to field marshals in command, the words echoed with chilling uniformity. The sword of Germany no longer belonged to the nation, it belonged to Adolf Hitler. The symbolism of the oath was reinforced by spectacle, for Hitler understood the power of ritual as well as decree. Torchlight parades filled the streets of Berlin, where banners bearing the swastika fluttered in the summer night. Churches held ceremonies where priests blessed the oath, transforming loyalty to Hitler into loyalty sanctified by God. School children recited pledges of allegiance, their voices blending with those of soldiers, clerks, and workers across the Reich. Goebbels' propaganda machine flooded newspapers with photographs of soldiers saluting their new Führer, their faces solemn and unwavering. Newsreels showed Hitler standing in front of the army, receiving their vows like a medieval monarch, anointed by destiny. To the German public the message was clear: the old order had died with Hindenburg, and a new one had risen in his place. The Führer was not a man of politics, but the embodiment of the nation itself. Through ritual and repetition, dictatorship became faith, and faith became obedience. For conservative elites, the death of Hindenburg removed their last illusion of influence. Aristocrats who had whispered in his ear, businessmen who had relied on his authority, and generals who had invoked his name now found themselves exposed. They had believed Hindenburg's presence would keep Hitler in check, a paternal figure protecting Germany from extremism. Instead, his death revealed how thoroughly Hitler had already dismantled the institutions they trusted. By merging offices, legalizing murder, and binding the army, Hitler rendered their influence meaningless. Many accepted the new order with resignation, convincing themselves that stability mattered more than legality. Others even welcomed it, relieved that power was concentrated in a leader who promised strength in a world of weakness. Yet beneath the relief was a quiet dread, for they had surrendered not only authority, but the possibility of resistance. They had gambled on Hitler to restore order, and now they discovered he had made himself master. The German public greeted the transformation with a mixture of reverence and relief, their fear softened by the propaganda of salvation. Hindenburg's funeral was staged as a national event, blending military tradition with Nazi spectacle. His coffin, draped in black, was escorted by honor guards through a sea of swastikas, the old imperial eagle now fused with Hitler's new symbols. Hitler delivered eulogies praising the field marshal, presenting himself not as a usurper but as a chosen heir. Newspapers framed the day as one of unity, where past and present merged to secure Germany's future. Millions listened by radio, their emotions stirred by the cadence of Hitler's voice and the grandeur of the ceremony. By the time the last salutes echoed across the fields of East Prussia, the transition felt not like a coup but like destiny fulfilled. Germans who had doubted found themselves swept into the tide of spectacle. The Fuhrer state was not imposed, it was embraced. Foreign governments observed the transformation with a mix of caution and resignation. In London, diplomats noted the troubling concentration of power, but consoled themselves with the belief that the army's loyalty might restrain Hitler. In Paris, politicians denounced the death of legality in Germany, though their own fractured government struggled to respond. Mussolini in Rome applauded Hitler, praising him as a fellow strongman who had swept away weakness in favor of destiny. In Washington, newspapers reported on the oath with alarm, but the Roosevelt administration maintained a policy of cautious distance. To the outside world, Germany appeared transformed overnight, though few yet grasped the permanence of the change. The Fuhrer state seemed a German phenomenon, an internal consolidation that might stabilize the Reich. Yet beneath the surface, the concentration of power in one man set Europe on a collision course with catastrophe. The world was watching, but it was not yet acting. By the close of August 1934, Hitler stood as both head of government and head of state, the supreme ruler of Germany without rival or restraint. The SA was shattered, the SS ascendant, the army bound, the conservatives silenced, and the public enthralled. His portrait hung in schools, offices, and homes, not as the image of a politician, but as the embodiment of the nation itself. The Constitution lay in tatters, replaced by the will of a man who claimed to be Germany incarnate. The death of Hindenburg had removed the last figure capable of challenging him, clearing the path for a dictatorship unlike any in modern Europe. From this moment forward, every decision, every law, every act of war or peace flowed from Hitler alone. The Fuhrer state was complete, born in blood and consecrated in obedience. And in that state, the future of Germany and the fate of the world now rested on the will of one man. The Night of the Long Knives was more than a moment of political violence. It was the founding act of Hitler's absolute dictatorship. In 3 days of bloodletting, the balance of power within the Nazi movement and the German state was irreversibly altered. The SA, once a revolutionary mass movement, had been broken and reduced to insignificance. Röhm, once Hitler's closest comrade, was dead in a prison cell, and with him died the dream of a second revolution. In their place rose the SS, the black-clad order of Himmler and Heydrich, a force of precision, secrecy, and unflinching loyalty. The army, relieved of its rival, surrendered its independence with an oath of personal obedience to the Fuhrer. The Reichstag legalized murder, confirming that law itself was now subservient to Hitler's will. The Purge was not an aberration, but a blueprint, a demonstration of how ruthlessness could become governance. And from that moment onward, dictatorship was not shadowed by legality. It was naked, absolute, and unchallenged. The transformation of the Nazi regime after June 1934 marked the beginning of totalitarian control over every sphere of German life. Political pluralism had already withered, But the Purge extinguished even the illusion of debate within the Nazi Party itself. Ministers who once believed themselves powerful discovered that their survival depended on obedience, not influence. The press, universities, and churches fell silent, knowing that dissent could be met with the same fate as Röhm. Fear seeped into every conversation, every household, every workplace, turning citizens into informants and neighbors into spies. The Gestapo expanded rapidly, empowered by the example of the Purge, its authority unchecked and its methods brutal. The regime no longer relied solely on propaganda to secure loyalty. It relied on terror to enforce silence. The state became not a servant of the people, but an instrument of Hitler's will. Totalitarianism was not declared. It was enacted in the bodies buried in June 1934. And it was enforced in the silence that followed. The rise of the SS in the aftermath of the Purge was perhaps its most consequential legacy. Once a marginal unit tasked with protecting Hitler personally, the SS emerged as the elite force of the regime, entrusted with responsibilities that far exceeded its original mandate. Its men, selected for loyalty and ideological purity, came to control prisons, intelligence, and concentration camps. Himmler envisioned the SS as a racial order, a state within the state, destined to shape Germany's future through discipline and terror. Heydrich's Sicherheitsdienst became the intelligence nerve center of the Reich, cataloguing enemies with clinical precision. The uniform of black wool and silver runes became synonymous with fear, a symbol of a new power rising in the shadows. Where the SA had been noisy, chaotic, and undisciplined, the SS was silent, methodical, and merciless. The Purge had proven their loyalty in blood, and in return they were granted power beyond imagination. From this seed grew the organization that would one day orchestrate genocide. For the army, the Purge was both victory and defeat, a paradox that would define its relationship with Hitler until 1945. On the one hand, the destruction of the SA preserved the army's monopoly on military power, soothing the generals who had feared being replaced. On the other, the oath of loyalty sworn in August 1934 bound them personally to Hitler, severing their independence. They had traded autonomy for survival, not realizing that in doing so they had chained themselves to a dictator who would lead them into catastrophe. In the short term, they celebrated, relieved that discipline and tradition had triumphed over the chaos of the stormtroopers. In the long term, they discovered they had become accomplices, their honor entangled with Hitler's crimes. The Purge had been their demand, but its price was their freedom. And when Hitler turned Germany toward war, they would discover that the oath they had sworn left them no escape. The Purge also reshaped German society by demonstrating that violence was not a last resort, but a governing principle. Ordinary citizens, witnessing the speed and brutality of the killings, learned that opposition carried mortal consequences. The lesson spread far beyond the Nazi Party, silencing trade unions, intellectuals, and church leaders who might have dreamed of resistance. The culture of fear created in June 1934 did not fade. It became the atmosphere in which the Reich thrived. From that point on, every German understood that politics was no longer contested with speeches or ballots, but with bullets and executions. Even those who admired Hitler's decisiveness absorbed the message that loyalty was conditional, fragile, and demanded at all times. The Night of the Long Knives did not merely remove enemies, it trained a nation in obedience. Fear became the mortar of dictatorship, binding the bricks of propaganda, law, and ideology into an unbreakable wall. And behind that wall, the machinery of war and genocide was already being built. Historians have long debated whether the Purge was driven by necessity, paranoia, or ambition, but its consequences are indisputable. By eliminating Röhm and his deputies, Hitler secured the loyalty of the army and the elites. By killing Schleicher, Strasser, and Kahr, he erased rivals and humiliations from the past. By expanding the Purge beyond the SA, he demonstrated that power was not limited by faction but by his own will. In every act, Hitler revealed the central principle of his dictatorship, that violence was not a tool but a foundation. The Purge was both a warning and a promise, a signal to friend and foe alike that no one was safe if they opposed him. It was the point at which dictatorship ceased to be fragile and became absolute. The lines of power were redrawn in blood, and in their new shape lay the contours of the coming Reich. What followed was not improvisation, but inevitability. The road from the Night of the Long Knives led directly to the catastrophe of the Second World War and the Holocaust. The Purge gave Hitler the unchallenged authority he needed to rearm in defiance of Versailles, to march troops into the Rhineland, and to annex Austria. It gave the SS the prestige and power that would one day be used to build ghettos, deportations, and extermination camps. It silenced generals and politicians who might have resisted aggression, binding them instead to the will of the Fuhrer. It trained Germany to accept terror as normal, preparing society to tolerate crimes of escalating scale. Without the Purge, Hitler might have remained a dictator hemmed in by rivals, his power fragmented. With it he became supreme, free to shape Germany's destiny unchecked. The Night of the Long Knives was not the war itself, nor the genocide, but it was the door through which both would pass. Its legacy was not just power but apocalypse. In the judgment of history, the Night of the Long Knives stands as one of the most ruthless consolidations of power in modern times. It was a turning point when dictatorship was not merely declared but enforced, when loyalty was proven not by words but by blood. It revealed Hitler's willingness to sacrifice comrades, allies, and friends alike to secure his supremacy. It demonstrated how terror could be wielded not only against enemies but against one's own ranks. And it set a precedent for the crimes that would follow, crimes on a scale that dwarfed even the Purge itself. Yet for contemporaries it was accepted, even applauded, as the act of a leader who had saved Germany from chaos. That acceptance, that silence, was the true victory of the Purge. It showed how fear and propaganda could bind a nation to its destroyer. The stormtroopers died, the SS rose, the army bent, and Hitler became master of the Reich. And from that mastery came war, destruction, and genocide, the terrible cost of silence in the face of tyranny.